Okay, we're going to get started, everyone. Is the mic on? Yeah. Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. Hope everyone's had some of the delicious breakfast. If you haven't, there's lots of it, so please do go and help yourselves. Good morning, everyone. Louise Herring from Main Progress. Just going to do a couple of kind of reflections on yesterday. First, I really wanted to thank everyone who was involved as speakers and panellists yesterday. I think we had a really rich set of conversations. They represented a really global picture of work on responsible recruitment across a breadth of organisations from government to civil society and corporates, and I personally found it really enriching. A few themes that I wanted to pick up on and just reflect on. The first was power. That word power was used several times by several speakers. I think a number of speakers talked about the powerless of migrant workers and how to translate that into a position of power. Maritza Perez Ovando provided her own really powerful testimony on the process and journey she'd gone through, but for me she really highlighted the need to put power in the hands of migrant workers, whether that be through pre-departure training, grievance mechanisms, organising, or a business model like the one that the Coalition of Immokalee Workers presented. So that theme of power really resonated with me. The second theme that really resonated was about the goal that we're working towards, so why we're all here. And I was really inspired by the vision of transitioning, as Rebecca from Labour Mobility Partnership said, from a small dysfunctional recruitment industry to a large and professional mobility industry, and thinking about how we maximise the contribution of migration to development. I also had some questions. These are unresolved, but they were prompted by the debate, but please don't ask me for answers. One of those questions was about whether the solution is circular migration. So that was presented by a couple of speakers. Is that the solution, or is that just reinforcing national borders and an us and them mentality? I have no conclusions on that one, just some questions. The other question that I had was about carrot and stick. So Gerardo, again from the coalition, talked about the market enforcing, making sure that supply chain actors that don't conform aren't allowed to participate. We also heard about the Qatar example of the state saying, this is the way you do it, and if you don't do it, you can't take part. And we talked about prosecutions, export bans. But at the same time, we were talking about capability building, capacity building of suppliers. And so in my head, there's a question of carrot and stick. How do those two come together? How do we balance them out? And then finally, in terms of reflections, I had some actions that certainly I feel like Aim Progress and its members can take forward. They may be actions that resonate. They may be things that your organisations are already doing. So we had that phrase, a tractor doesn't tell a farmer how to run his farm. And that really struck with me, that idea that workers aren't central to this solution. And that's definitely an action for me that needs to be taken forward more, that idea of inclusive by design, involving migrant workers in the development of the solution, making sure their voices are at the forefront. That's critical, and that's something I don't think is being done enough in the corporate sphere, certainly, that idea of needing to be more kind of human-centric. So that was one action to take forward. The second one from yesterday was about financing and investment solutions, recognising that ethical recruitment has a cost. It's a cost that's higher than non-ethical recruitment. It requires support. We need employers that are willing to pay for that. We also need ways to support ethical recruiters from an investment perspective. So a second set of action about financing investment. I know that's something we're going to take forward tomorrow. And then the third action that I came back to was around collaborations. Agnieszka from Fundacja Nowina talked about collaboration is hard, but we know we need to do more. And I think we heard yesterday about lots of collaborations between different partners, between funders, led by civil society. And we ended the day with John from IHRB and Mahmoud Qutab from Qatar talking about an example of collaboration between different sectors, difficult dialogues that potentially created change. So I wanted to kind of finish with that kind of reflection on collaborations, thinking about, even if they're difficult collaborations, what actions do they yield, what learnings do we get from them? And then my final kind of reflection was coming back to that idea of labour mobility. There's a book by Parag Khanna called Move, which people may have read, which is all about this idea of breaking down national borders, thinking about migration as something that is a global movement and something we need to lean into. And there's a quote within there from Peter Drucker, who's a management consultant. And his quote, and one that I'd ask you to think about today, is, "The greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence itself, but to act with yesterday's logic." So I'd encourage us all today to think about what is tomorrow's logic? How do we collectively come up with that? How do we change the framework and take the ideas from today so we can deal with the turbulence going forward? So thank you very much indeed. I'm going to hand over to Neil, who's going to talk through the logistics for the day.
Hi everyone and welcome back. Before I do talk through logistics, a couple of reflections from me. And one of my reflections is this: the Justice for Wage Theft campaign. So it's one of these things that's a recurring item on the agenda whenever we talk about migrant workers, that migrant workers are cheated, scammed, tricked in many ways, in many sectors, in many locations, from wages that are rightfully theirs. It came to prominence during COVID, perhaps, when we became much more aware of workers being sent home without wages due owing. But we also all know that it's actually a regular occurrence for many of those workers who are doing these undervalued jobs in the economy. Sumaya, one of our colleagues from Migrant Forum in Asia, has brought these T-shirts along. Please talk to our colleagues from Migrant Forum in Asia about the campaign, how you might be able to get involved, how you might be able to get one of these great T-shirts as well. So thanks, Sumaya. The other thing that I just wanted to flag up as well, one of the things that you guys won't see because you're here in the room, but the online audience will see, there's an interview between myself and Saket Soni, who is the author of this book, The Great Escape. Some of you might have already read it. The Great Escape, a true story of forced labour and immigrant dreams in America. And it tells the tale of a group of migrant workers from India who came to help with the clean-up after Hurricane Katrina and ended up trapped in a situation of forced labour. And it was like their struggle for freedom originally and then their struggle for justice. So that interview will be online, available for download later, but you also might like to check out Sonny's book. And then just the same housekeepings as yesterday. We're very pleased to see so much action on social media. Some people have been doing great posts for us. LinkedIn, Facebook, and a very heavy presence on Twitter as well. That's absolutely great. Thank you very much. Just to remind you, the hashtag for the event is hashtag GFRR2023. And you can also post your thoughts on the online wall on the event app as well. And just to remind you about questions, all questions will need to be submitted online. There's a link on your desks, and if you're the online audience, then put your questions into the chat. They all go through to our question moderator, Bonnie, who will then put them to the panelists later. So that's the way that you submit links. So having said that, we've got 1 minute to go before we start our first panel of the day. Today we're going to be talking about shipping and logistics. Many of us have spent a lot of time wondering and worrying and trying to work towards better outcomes for those who produce goods and deliver services. And perhaps shipping and logistics is something where to date there's not been enough attention paid. And yet we know that many migrant workers are employed either directly or indirectly in shipping and logistics. They're lorry drivers, they're ship workers, they're also shipyard workers, and the people who build the docks and things like that. Of course, they're also the workers who end up breaking ships at the end of ships' lives. So IHRB has got a long-running shipping program now, and we're going to have 2 really good sessions about that. So thank you all very much. I hope we have another really good day, and please do join in and get social. Thank you.
Can all hear me? I'm Francesca Fairbairn. I work for the Institute for Human Rights and Business on our shipping programme. And as Neil said, we've heard a lot in the last couple of day or so, and generally about corporate due diligence in terms of the workers who make the products, who get the products, who pick the crops, who mine the extractives, who build the buildings, who manufacture the goods and so on. But what about the workers who transport the goods, who get the goods from source to factory, from factory floor to shop floor, and then to our door? They're not exactly migrant workers, but they do travel for work. And they're the largely invisible lifeblood of our economy, keeping our supply chains moving. There's a very overused statistic that 90% of world trade travels by sea, so I won't quote that. But shipping is one element of a vast and very long delivery chain. And many of you, and by you I'm talking to kind of corporates, may not even have thought of the transport part of your supply chain in terms of human rights due diligence, but it is important. In many cases, they're direct customers. And during the pandemic, we realised the importance of transport workers, particularly in the maritime sector. It was a huge crew change crisis, and hopefully Martha Selwyn from UN Global Compact will touch on that in the part 2 of this panel. But since then, the shipping industry, big brands have started to look at human rights due diligence in terms of their transport. IHRB, together with the Sustainable Shipping Initiative and the RAFTO Foundation, produced a Code of Conduct for delivering on seafarers' rights. There's a card on your tables with a QR code for that, which you can have a look at after. And there's a self-assessment questionnaire that goes with that. And again, Christopher Saunders from RightShip will talk about that in part 2 of this panel in terms of human rights due diligence. Just a bit of detail. So when we're talking about seafarers, particularly talking about the merchant navy, we're not talking today about seafarers on fishing vessels, and we know there are many issues with recruitment fees and other egregious human rights violations on fishing vessels, but we're looking particularly today at the merchant navy, so that's seafarers on bulk carriers, oil tankers, container ships, and so on, particularly container ships, of course. So part 1 will focus on seafarers and recruitment fees. And again, we would like to look at more of the transport chain. We're going to focus on seafarers today, but of course it is important to look at the whole of the transport chain. There just isn't any data that we know of, apart from this new data that we've published on seafarers. And then part 2 will look at human rights due diligence options for companies and opportunities for governments and port state controls, etc., to improve the situation. And part 2 will be moderated by the multi-skilled Bonnie Ling here, who's on questions for part 1. So what are the risks? I'll just quickly introduce the panel. So on the right, speaking from London, is Mark Dickinson. Hi, Mark. Can you hear me? Excellent. Mark is General Secretary of Nautilus International, which is a maritime union, represents 20,000 mariners. Mark, I think, first went to sea at 16. He was involved in the original drafting of the Maritime Labour Convention, which is the piece of legislation, and Mark leads on the Seafarers Representatives Delegation in negotiating improvements to that convention, and we'll come back to that in a second. Here on my left, Isabel Rickmers, speaking from Germany. Can you hear me? Yes, good. I hope we'll be able to hear her in a second. Isabel is founder and CEO of Turtle, which is a maritime recruitment platform. It connects seafarers and shipping companies, and crucially, it doesn't charge worker recruitment fees. So it's the employer pays principal model. And here on stage, on my left, is Ben Bailey. Ben is Director of Programme at the Mission to Seafarers, which is the predominant global charity supporting seafarers around the world. And Ben can give you some more figures when we come to him, but supports seafarers in over 200 ports. And Ben oversees the mission's work on prevailing issues, so one of which is abandonment, and Neil was just talking about wage theft. That's a whole other topic, not for today, but a very, very big one. And if you want to know more about that, please talk to Ben afterwards or online. And also the huge issue of recruitment fees, which we're going to talk about today. So if I turn to Mark, first of all, hi Mark. First of all, just some basics. How many merchant seafarers are there? Where do they come from? What countries? You know, just a few basic stats for us.
Thanks, Francesca, and good morning, everybody there in New York. Sorry I couldn't be with you, but very pleased to join this really important forum and make my humble contribution. So, according to the ILO, Francesca, there's about 1.6 million seafarers globally. Predominantly, they would come from what we call the labor supply countries. The Philippines, India, Indonesia, China, Russia, Ukraine would be the most predominant. 20% of the global labor market in seafaring is supplied by the Philippines alone. So that's the sort of scale. You're talking probably about 70,000 merchant vessels engaged in international trade.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just going to occasionally refer to a company called Klaveness, who unfortunately couldn't speak with us today, but they are a Norwegian ship operator. And I was speaking to Torbjørn Eider, who works for Klaveness, yesterday, and like many ship operators, they recruit their seafarers mainly from Romania and Philippines, and generally seafarers tend to come, as you'll all know from your other work, from countries where the charging of recruitment fees and corruption is generally more widespread. Klaveness gets around that by round the issue of recruitment fees by owning their own agencies for recruiting their crew, but we'll come back to that. So perhaps, Mark, you could just talk to us a little bit about the Maritime Labour Convention and what the law is regarding the charging of recruitment fees to seafarers.
Okay, thanks again, Francesca. So, look, shipping has always been special, and I don't say that simply because I'm an ex-seafarer and one tends to think about one's own industry and career through probably rose-tinted spectacles, but it is a global industry, and it's always been at the forefront of international standard setting under the auspices of, primarily in this field, we're talking about the International Labour Organization. So there is a whole range of instruments that have been adopted as far back as in the early days of the ILO. So 1920 is probably the first convention that was adopted for seafarers. But most importantly, and this is the point of your question, in 2006, all of those instruments that have been adopted through tripartite discussions in the ILO were consolidated into one convention called the Maritime Labour Convention. A lot of work went into that. It took the best part of 10 years to get to the point where it was adopted. But it was adopted in 2006 and it entered into force in August 2013. It's been ratified by 102 countries. The last time I checked the ILO website, representing 97% of the world fleet. So it's pretty well the standard. It's adopted by pretty much everybody who's serious about shipping, whether that be from a flag state perspective, a port state, or a labour supply perspective. And it's sometimes often referred to as particularly by the seafarers themselves, the Seafarers' Bill of Rights. It's also, sorry, Francesca, you wanted to ask another question?
Well, just perhaps for people in the room and online who may not understand the difference between a flag state and a port state and what that means, just very, very quickly explain. I know it's hard to explain quickly.
So a flag state is where the ships are registered, because every ship has to be registered somewhere. And port states are the countries where the ships visit. And they're important, obviously the labour supply states are the countries where the seafarers come from. So a flag state is primarily responsible for what happens on ships registered in its territory. So in my own case, I'm from the UK. We have a flag or a registration that we often refer to as the Red Ensign, flies on the back of all UK registered ships. And the UK is responsible for enforcing standards, national, regional, and also international standards on that vessel. Port states have additional obligations. They check the standards on ships visiting their ports. So under the MLC, the flag state is primarily responsible. They check everything. They issue certificates to the vessel. The port state will then check that those standards are being applied. And interestingly, under the Maritime Labour Convention, the port state has an obligation not just to check the ships of countries that have ratified the convention, but also apply the same standards under a no less favourable treatment provision to ships that have not registered or not registered in a country that has ratified the convention. So the goal there is to establish a level playing field and apply the standards, the minimum standards, to everybody with the same force.
I mean, we know for sure that there are states that are referred to as flags of convenience, right, where a shipping company might choose to have its vessel flagged under that state because they indeed advertise that they will put less pressure on you in terms of environmental and human rights regulations and requirements.
Yeah, it is, of course, the scourge of the shipping industry, and it's been that way for, at least the International Transport Workers Federation, who I'm also heavily involved in, and when I'm at the ILO representing seafarers, I do so under the auspices of that organisation. They've been running a campaign against flags of convenience for 75 years, and this year is the 75th anniversary of that campaign. And they're fighting to establish what's referred to in international law as a genuine link between the ship owner and the flag that is flown on the rear of the ship owner's vessel. And that link does not exist with flags of convenience because they're there for the convenience of the owner.
Yeah. So perhaps if we just come back to recruitment fees, what does the MLC say in relation to recruitment fees?
So the MLC is absolutely clear about the payment of fees to secure an employment. It outlaws that practice, so it's illegal, if you like. There is a very clear provision that no fees can be paid for jobs, and I know that that's comparable with broadly comparable with the employer pays principle that applies to shore-based workers. I think that the difficulty, and if I may just elaborate a little, the difficulty I think with the MLC is that it codifies long-established practices where the seafarer themselves, as a maritime professional, is responsible for their own documentation to establish their qualifications and their competence and their medical fitness. So it is possible under the MLC to charge a fee for a medical certificate. The seafarer has to have a discharge book. That's where their service on the vessel is recorded. So they have to have those, and the administration in their labour supply country, in their home country, would charge for that. They have to have a passport. Under the MLC, the employer must cover the cost of visas, but as I say, there's the possibility that the seafarer would have to pay for the certificate, their own passport, the discharge book, and indeed also under another convention, an identity document. Which isn't compulsory, but is increasingly becoming necessary to establish your bona fide credentials as a seafarer. So I think. Sorry, Francesca.
Well, I was going to say we'll come back to. I mean, those in the room and probably many of you online will know about IHRB's micro programs debt burden graphic, where it shows all the things that can sort of sit under the umbrella of recruitment fees, and we'll talk about that a bit more when I talk to Ben Bailey. But perhaps just before I move on to Isabel, I could just ask you, Mark, to just tell us a little bit about the work that ITF, the International Transport Workers Federation, has been doing in relation to recruitment agencies illegally charging fees to seafarers.
Two things I think it's really important to highlight, and these are fairly new initiatives, relatively new initiatives, and they are responding to the ITF's experience, which incidentally very much chimes with the research that the Turtle has so fantastically produced. So the first one I'd mention is there's the ITF Ship Be Sure project, which is a website where seafarers can go. They can report employment scams. They can report agents for charging fees. And they can also secure advice on employment and contract advice. I have to say that I'm I wouldn't say I'd be 100% confident, but one of the best ways in which a seafarer can protect themselves from being scammed or for being charged illegal fees is to secure employment under a collective bargaining agreement signed by an ITF affiliated union. That's an outrageous plug on behalf of ITF and ITF affiliates, but I'm absolutely clear that is the best way to protect a seafarer. Make sure they sign an agreement which is linked to a collective bargaining agreement, and then you've got somebody to turn to. So all of that information and all of that advice and the ability to report is on the ITF Ship Be Sure website. And a new initiative, literally just announced this first quarter of this year, is the Seafarers Breach of Rights Index, which the ITF is basically going to call out this bad behaviour and name and shame the employers and the crew agents who breach seafarers' fundamental rights. I could say so much more about that, Francesca, but and I'm happy to send links to anybody that wants to access information on those two ITF initiatives. But they're really evidence that the ITF is prepared to get its shoulder behind, calling out these unacceptable practices and empower seafarers and support them to make a difference.
Yeah. And for those of you who don't know, I'm sure many of you do, the ITF is a transport workers federation, so it covers not just seafarers. It represents, I think, 40 million transport workers, and it has a very active inspectorate that goes on board ships and does a lot of work around recruitment fees as well. Okay, thanks very much, Mark. We'll come back to you. I'd like to move on now to Isabel. So in April this year, IHRB, together with SSI, Sustainable Shipping Initiative, published this research briefing on seafarers and recruitment fees based on data provided by Turtle, which uncovered widespread illegal charging of recruitment fees among seafarers. So, Isabel, I'm hoping that your presentation is going to come up. I just need to find the clicker. Did I leave the clicker on the table? I did. Sorry. Just going to get the clicker. Perhaps you could pull up Isabel's presentation. I'll just grab the...
You let me know once it's up?
Yeah, we'll let you know once it's up. Yeah, it's not here quite yet.
It's on this side. It's on these ends. It's on both ends.
Oh, yes, so it is. Okay, so it's up. Sorry, I thought you might be able to see it, but yeah, so here we go. We've got slide 2 up, which is
yeah, I see it. It's all good.
Oh, you see it.
Yeah,
Great.
thank you very much. Good morning as well from Germany. I'm in Munich, and I couldn't join either. But yeah, thank you very much for inviting me and for contributing. So a very brief anecdote to how we came actually to this report is that, as Francesca said, we are a startup. We connect directly seafarers with shipping companies. I have to say that my background is in shipping, so I work in shipping since 2010 in a ship management company. I was also managing director, so I'm very much I know all, let's say, operational structures. I know also how, how to recruit, or how the typical recruitment works. It's through the local manning agencies that we also use, and as Mark greatly outlined, this charging of recruitment fees to seafarers is illegal. And as per my opinion, before then, I didn't even think this would be a big problem. I have to outline that. So when we set up this platform 2 years ago, or actually 2.5 years ago, I heard actually through my colleagues that they reported seafarers asking how much it would cost, and that actually rang a bell. And then we said, okay, maybe we need to look into that. We teamed up also with the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network to get some support from there. And then we initiated first a smaller survey and then a larger survey across our database, which at that point consists 80,000 seafarers. And we got in total 5,000 respondents on the first question, which was whether they experienced any kind of corruption in connection to recruitment process or while working. And there we found that, as also Francesca said, nearly 40%, so 39% said yes, and that the type of corruption was greatly connected to manning agencies, local manning agencies, where they paid fee to, which is strictly illegal. There's no gray zone about this. If you pay for getting a job, this is simply not. This is not as per MLC. So we found that the weakest part is actually for the seafarers. It seemed, according to our survey, within recruitment, and the parties charging are the local manning agencies. And then there are also, different further topics where the agents could charge, which is, for example, fake jobs. So you tell the seafarer, well, I have a great job for you, but you need to do some advance payment, and then, a few days later, the job is not there anymore. We also heard that, you tell the seafarer there's a great job, but you only need to do this and that training. Then the seafarer does this and that training, and then afterwards, the job is not there anymore. So there are also quite creative, call it, ways of charging. And apart from the direct charging, there are also ways to indirectly charge. So when you, for example, when it comes to payment of wages, there might be some kind of fees which are connected to the transfer of the money. So I think, we haven't deep dived into that whole infrastructure, but from the outset, as Francesca said, there's an issue. And the second part to that is that we found that most of them did not even report it. Because they said they did not really know where to report, and some also said that they were afraid. But I think this shows in greatness that we have some issue there. And if we go to, or are there any questions at this stage?
No, I think if we move, it's difficult because I can't see the slide, but I think the next slide showing is about nationality.
Yeah. So we found that actually the locations where corruption happened in most cases it was in India and then Nigeria, but also Ukraine, Philippines, Ghana, Pakistan. So it's quite widespread. But India being the respondents who said that it happens being predominantly from India. But again, I think it's a widespread topic, and I think it also owes a bit to the structure of our database, where I think close to 40% of all in the database are from India. So there's a natural, kind of divergence in that. But so Ukraine, also to mention, a very current case. I was talking to a potential customer from Greece, and then they reported about their current agency setup, and actually said that they stopped relationship with one Ukrainian agency because they found after a while that they had diverse practices to charge the seafarers, be it keeping, especially the ratings, so for everyone, it's like the lower ranks. And there it was clearly keeping part of the wages. So from a 6-month contract, it cost 2 months to get this contract, so they kept the wages. That they charged 5 times the price of a coffee in the waiting area where the seafarers actually waited for, some interviews or so. So I mean, this is quite widespread, but we will also further investigate on that. But it seems to be, hopefully not, but a bit of tip of the iceberg here that we need to look into.
I mean, I'll come back to kind of, again, other things that sit under the umbrella of recruitment fees when I'm talking to Ben, and of course, you know, this survey, you know, if you want to be strict about survey sampling, it was a self-selecting sample, but by any statistical measure, this is a very significant result, right? 5,000 people, and you know, as you say, Isabel, you know, there are a lot of Indians there, possibly because there are a disproportionate number of Indians on the database, but then perhaps they're attracted to Turtle because they're one of the few recruitment platforms that do offer the employer pays principle, so not having to pay for fees for jobs. So, but just before I move on to Ben, I just wanted to ask you, and I just, in reference to some conversations that we were having yesterday, we had James Malik of Proforce on stage, who was talking about his viable, successful business model based on no worker fees. You know, I mean, it almost seems like a sort of silly question to ask as the answer's so obvious, but, you know, is the responsible recruitment model a viable one in shipping, given how prevalent the illegal charging of recruitment fees is? So perhaps you can just talk about Turtle a little bit more in that context, its rate of growth and so on.
Yeah. So as I said initially, you know, why I set up the marketplace, I mean, after my, at that point, 9.5 or 9 years experience in shipping, is that I thought, you know, it's a more efficient way of actually finding each other to connect the seafarers and shipping companies directly. So I never actually thought of a value add through this employer pays principle, because I actually assumed that MLC, or this part of MLC, is strictly kept, to be very frank. So this value proposition of, you know, doing more like clean or ethical recruitment, you know, developed through actually all the seafarers registering, and this is really where we see a big enthusiasm that you know, we have approximately 6,000 new registrations per month. Many come already directly, so they, you know, hear from others about us and they come directly. So yeah, it you know, this let's say wrong market mechanisms definitely pushed us. On the other hand, if you look at the shipping companies being our customers paying for the service of finding a seafarer, I don't really see that they appreciate this specific part, given, because if you talk to them, it is more a matter of they say, well, yeah, it's somehow happening, but it's not happening with us. Because also, you know, they, same as we had in my former companies, you have an audit. So you normally, I mean, leaving COVID aside, but you visit the manning agent and you do an audit with them, so to make sure that actually everything is fine. But and no one would assume that this kind of things happen. So I think there's a bit of you know, distortion. So the seafarers value it a lot, and I think this is also a key driver for many to register. On the shipping company side, I don't really. They appreciate having, you know, this global reach database. Some of them ask whether we charge the seafarers, which we obviously not, but it's not really, I would say, a value proposition for them, because they think everything's fine so far.
Yeah, and I think just going back to what you said, you know, you assumed that this wasn't a problem because, you know, and I think that's the case within the shipping industry and within customers of the shipping industry. So brands who maybe have annual contracts with shipping companies, or charterers who maybe charter entire ships, so they have slightly, you know, for an amount of time or a voyage, a slightly different relationship with the ship owners. But there's an assumption, well, that, I mean, they obviously they follow the law, they follow the Maritime Labour Convention, therefore this isn't a problem. So, and that is an assumption that is being challenged by research like this. There are a couple of charts that I will flick over in the next sort of minute or two, just with quotes of some of the seafarers, but there are hundreds of other quotes, and you can find more in the briefing. And for those of you here, on the table, the cards on the other side, there's a QR code for that briefing, and in a minute or two I'll pop that up on the presentation, so that those of you online can get direct access to it as well, although I believe it's also on the event portal. But thanks, Isabel. So Ben, if I can just move on to you. So perhaps you can, well, firstly just tell us a little bit about the Mission Seafarers and what they do.
Yeah, sure. So the Mission to Seafarers is one of the world's largest maritime welfare charities. We work in 200 ports across 50 countries. We have a network of 121 seafarers centre, and last year, for example, our teams around the world carried out 39,000 ship welfare visits. We also have family networks where we work with seafarers' families in their communities in places like India, Myanmar and the Philippines.
And so really, you know, you have a kind of really widespread contact with seafarers across many countries and across many issues. And I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about when the issue of recruitment fees first came across your radar, Mr. Seafarers, or if it's always been there, or...
Well, I think, yes, there's been an issue of it. And, you know, even if you look back in history and you look at, you know, seafarers who were recruited in the 1800s, crimping, Shanghaiing, the term was used then, you know, seafarers have always been open to exploitation. I think particularly for us, it tends to be in very set examples when, I think I need to be closer to the mic, particularly set examples. So, for example, I can think of a crew who were abandoned on a supply vessel off a country in the Arabian Gulf not too long ago. They were left without food, without water, without oil to run the generator, and all of the seafarers on board, all the Indian nationals, had not been paid for several months. And those seafarers had actually paid $2,000 per person to secure the job on board that. And what was interesting about their case was that the employer who had recruited them onto the vessel had actually put them in touch with a credit bureau who would then loan them the money so that they could then pay the employer to get the job. And so when the ship then became abandoned, the seafarers and the families were still being chased by bailiffs. And so even though that credit bureau knew full well that the employer had abandoned the ship and that there was no money there. So, and that is not a particularly extreme example of some of the cases that we will get involved with.
Yeah, and we'll come back to that in a minute, as I say. But do you, and I know this is a difficult question, but do you have a feel for how much they're generally paying? I mean, you said there, I can't remember, sorry, $2,000 or $3,000, and you know it must vary widely by country, by job, by rank, by
it does. I mean, as you know, we've actually, based on the work that Turtle have done, we've commissioned some research by Liverpool John Moores University to look at this issue in a bit more detail. At the moment, the stories that we're getting range from anywhere from sort of $50 to $100, right the way through to officer class. One seafarer who's claimed that he's paid $7,500 for that job. The average from what we've seen so far is around about $1,800 per contract. And I don't know what Isabel has seen from her data, but we would estimate that from what we've seen so far, around 10% of our respondents are still in some form of debt bondage as a result of the high impact, the high interest loans and the compound interest which is being charged.
We'll come back to that, but just before, so shipping as a career is very hierarchical. You know, much like the kind of the Navy itself. So there are ratings, who are the lower ranks, cadets, middle ranks, and officers. Higher ranks, obviously, and the Turtle research I think showed that recruitment fees were being 45% was reported by officers. So it is across, and presumably that may be for promotions or I'm not sure, but it is across the board from bottom to top. And I don't know. We'll have to do more research to work out how the fee structures are generally spread across that. But so just in terms of, and I'll come back afterwards to how these debt burdens impact seafarers and their families. But first I could just talk to you about what form recruitment fees can take. Now you talked there about loans and Torbjörn, who I was talking to yesterday, he said that there's a sort of system within a system of crewing agencies and less reputable shipping companies loaning money to seafarers, say perhaps enormous, not an advance on your salary, but enormous advances on loans before you even start paying. So, and then you all know the patterns, right? It starts off being 10% a year, then it's 10% a month, then it's 20%, and so on. And then before you know it, you've got a debt that's many, many times the amount you originally borrowed, and you can't leave that employer until you've paid it off. And Torbjörn gave several very difficult examples of that. Another one is these very long internships that crewing agencies in the Philippines have, where before you might have done your training to become a rating, but you have to do a year-long internship or apprenticeship within the agency office, being paid nothing before you even get to start your seafaring career. So I wonder if you know of any other things like that, Ben. I know there are plenty of them.
Yeah, I think the issue that you've just highlighted about what in the Philippines is called utility seafarers, and so as you rightly say, yes, these crew. I would hesitate to call and be reluctant to call it an internship. Many of them will be living in dormitories, seafarer dormitories in Manila. Many of them will actually be living under quite a lot of fear for their employers. Some of them will even be subjected to physical abuse. We've dealt with many seafarers who are utilities who've been there. But the basic premise is that they take on the role as a gopher in the office. They will be required to go to places like Luneta Park in Manila and find seafarers and fix them up with jobs with certain companies, in the hope that at the end of their time they may be given a contract, but there is no guarantee that happens. I mean, certainly from some of the stories that we deal with seafarers, seafarers tell us that when they go to get a job, they will then be told, well, actually, you need to pay this additional recruitment fee, because otherwise your application will go to the bottom of the pile. And therefore you won't get it. Another seafarer from India told us, and it's always anecdotally, we thought was the biggest issue was in India and Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that this data has highlighted that. But one company took the seafarer certificates to process, as would be a regular thing to happen. But then they were told they had to pay money to get those certificates back, or they would risk being defaced or damaged. And we're increasingly finding seafarers who are saying to us that their documentation is being kept by the agency in a way so as to prevent them from finding alternative employment. Now, on the one hand, you could argue that a responsible employer might want to retain the best people that they possibly can, but it does suggest that there is something sinister going on if we're sort of preventing seafarers from looking for alternative employment.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that there is a difference, and there's a chart. I won't flip back to it, but you can find it in the briefing. There is a difference in ships as on land, where I believe it's normal practice, Mark, right, for the ship's captain to keep your passport while you were on board, and that's not considered a kind of nefarious practice, if that's the right word. However, your passport being kept by a manning agency very much is.
Yeah,
and that those are two sort of slightly different things. But I guess, and we've touched on this in terms of the impact of debt burden on workers a lot in the last day or so, but perhaps you can just talk about the impact of debt burden on seafarers and their families.
Yeah, very much so. So, I mean, somewhere like the Philippines and other labour supplying countries, one seafarer will be supporting up to 14 members of their family, both close and extended. And many of the crews that we work with don't have much of a concept of financial planning. So the idea of saving for a rainy day, or pensions, or putting some money aside for an unexpected bill just doesn't happen. I mean, I remember one seafarer saying to me that the day before he goes home, he'll get a contact from his family with a whole list of people that he actually owes money to, because the family have taken out loans, or they've made promises to members, etc. And so he said he felt like a human ATM. And so, that puts huge amounts of pressure if all of a sudden that income is not coming in, and even more pressure if obviously there are loans that need to be paid that can't be met. And I think certainly what we are seeing is that, this seafaring is stressful enough. Any seafarer will tell you that. But when you're then dealing with this additional financial burden, it absolutely has a detrimental impact on their mental health and well-being, and indeed on some seafarers' families' personal safety.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about it being stressful enough, there's a new clause in the Maritime Labour Convention that Mark negotiated that comes into force, I don't know if it's this year, but he negotiated it last summer, where seafarers are allowed Wi-Fi, not even under all circumstances, but under some. And, perhaps brands doing responsible, looking at human rights due diligence in their supply chain would say, well, why should we supply one element of our supply chain with Wi-Fi, but not the rest of them. But of course, seafarers, they're away from their families for up to 11 months, and of course during the crew change crisis it was more than that, and they might have very little contact with their family if they have to pay for Wi-Fi in order to call home. And indeed, I think I can't remember the name of the boat. It's a Japanese ship called the Wakashio or something. Is that right? Yeah. Where there was an oil spill off the Maldives because it was going close to the coast to try to get Wi-Fi for its sailors so that they could get land phone reception so that they could call home. So it is very, very stressful. And to go back to what you were talking about the human ATM, I mean, Torbjörn talks about the breadwinner tradition, and just this idea that there is a lot of pressure on this and these debts, and it's something you all know very well. Yesterday, I can't remember who it was, said they're only one typhoon away from losing everything they spent all their money on. So these situations, financial situations, are extremely tenuous. So I guess my last question to you, Ben, is from your work with Liverpool John Moores and so on, what do you think seafarers' awareness is of the MLC and the kind of illegality of recruitment?
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing from our research and certainly anecdotally from when me and my colleagues deal with seafarers on the ground, I don't think there's necessarily a problem with seafarers understanding the Maritime Labour Convention and what some of their rights are.
Oh, okay.
I mean, certainly 70% of our respondents said to us, they knew about the MLC, they knew what they were entitled to, and certainly I have seafarers that are in difficulty and they'll say to me, well, the MLC says this, but I'm not getting it, or can you connect me to the ITF because this is not happening. I think so. I'm not sure it's about seafarers. I think the bigger issue is around inspection and enforcement.
Yeah.
So Mark spoke very eloquently about the fact that yes, the MLC is covering 97% of the world's tonnage, but there are still a number of geographical black holes where seafarers can be open to exploitation. Places around the Arabian Gulf, for example, where certainly that is a problem. And so you've got these holes where there isn't the coverage, and then also you've got some countries that just simply don't have the resources. They might have ratified the convention, but they don't actually have the port state inspectors to be able to carry out the inspections. Yeah. So that is certainly a big issue. But I would just very, very quickly say that, we're not talking about some of the, the big well-known lines here. Very often it is those seafarers who are stuck at sort of working at a very low level, who are unfortunately the ones who are the most exploited.
They are the most exploited, yes, but the widespreadness, sorry, I can't think of the word at the moment, of the charging of recruitment fees, that will be some of the bigger brands, unfortunately, some of their vessels. And I think in terms of reporting, a lot of the quotes, I think, Isabel, from the research were, well, what's the point? No one will listen. I'll get into trouble. I'll lose my job, and so on. And those are all sentiments that you've all have heard in your own industries here in the room and online. I wonder. I'll just turn back to Mark and ask him a question, and then perhaps Bonnie, are there any questions coming in?
Hi, everyone. So we have one. I think it's fairly straightforward, and there are others. I have one. So please send in your questions because we are reading them and checking. So the first question is, well, if a seafarer already has his or her passport, should employers repay the fees of that passport? And if there are no other questions, I would like to go back to, if I may, the point that Mark raised earlier in the discussion. And we had a separate thread on this, so it's a bit unfair, but I think it's quite interesting because Mark talks about certain traditions in maritime that are established where seafarers pay for his or her own book and medical certificate. and passport. And we see a divergence of this if we look at the IO definitions of recruitment fees and related cost, a 2019 publication. So in fact, we're looking at possibly two different developments on what is meant by recruitment fees and related costs, one for land-based workers and another one for seafarers. So I was wondering, could you go into some details about this? Are we going to narrow this gap, or are these going to be separate divergent developments in international law? Thanks.
Thanks, Bonnie. I'm going to put both those questions to Mark, if I may. But before I do, I think there's just so many elements that make the seafarer's life just unique, as Mark said, and different to land-based workers. So, a seafarer might come from the Philippines, board an Australian boat registered in Panama, in Singapore, take a load of cargo down to South Africa. He will then get off there. The cargo will then go on and be dropped off. For a lot of that, he'll be in high waters, which is no national jurisdiction. He might have gone through various jurisdictions. There are just so many legal complications that make it very, 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 very difficult. So I'm not sure that it would be practical or worthwhile to converge them together. But Mark, you'll know more about that than me.
Sorry, do you want me to come in, Francesca?
Yes, please. Sorry.
Okay, the sound dropped quite substantially, so I think I got everything that you both said, and I'll try and fashion a coherent response to that. The first thing I want to say that, and this I suppose goes to Bonnie's question, yes, the industry has developed traditions and ways of working which reflect what was special and very unusual about shipping. But today, I think, or recently, since the sort of the real dominance and emergence of globalization, that global economy, and how people recognize that we're all connected and we expect things, we know things come from overseas and arrive the next day. We've got I think there's a lot more sense of how that all hangs together. I think there's less an argument for that, for us to be treated differently. I think that's a good thing, because it says, if in a shore-based occupation, it would be an absolute anathema to suggest that you pay fees to get a job, why should it be different for shipping? There is no case now for treating seafarers. There's less of a case for treating seafarers differently than you would shore-based workers. And I think, your colleague, you spoke to the guy from Klaveness, Torpen, and I get the sense that they would never countenance that. Isabella also made, I think, the same point regards her own experience in shipping, and that's as it should be. Where there are specific requirements needed to address peculiar aspects of shipping, then okay, we need to develop our own methodology. But the established principles that seafarers are key workers, but they're workers, and they have the same fundamental employment and social rights as any other worker, and I think is really, really important. I think that's reflected in the MLC. But we're on a journey. The MLC is just a bunch of standards that's been consolidated. It's minimum standards. And there is an obligation in the MLC to continuously improve those standards. It's not static. We establish a level playing field. The quid pro quo for the level playing field is continuous improvement in the minimum standards of seafarers. And that's the journey we're on. The MLC's been amended 3 times already. Thank you for mentioning that, Francesca. And we'll be back in the ILO in Geneva in 2025, and I can guarantee this issue will be on the agenda. And I'll thank Isabella and Turtle for the work they've done, because it provides us with the context for changes. So, I think it's really important. Somebody mentioned in the introductory comments, and I was listening very carefully, the word collaboration was mentioned about 4 or 5 times. And I think it's going to be really, really important that we collaborate to make that case in Geneva in 2025. And that's a collaboration across the piece. The ship owners need to be on board with this. The flag states need to be on board. Of course, the port states need to be on board. Cargo owners as well, they can play their part. They can ask the question. the MLC's minimum standards, but it's not the cap. I mean, you should ask the question, is that good enough? Is a minimum standard good enough? Our shore-based workers don't pay fees. They don't pay for their passports. They don't pay for their discharge books. They don't charge, their medical certificates. So why should the seafarers? I think that's a really important part of this conversation. Everybody, all the stakeholders involved, the welfare charities have got a significant role to play too. Thanks, Ben, for your contribution and your insight, which is really, really important. We've all got to collaborate to continue that journey of continuous improvement and make an absolute difference. There was one specific question about whether somebody who's already got a passport should have them compensated. All I would say is there are many, many good employers out there, many good ship owners who absolutely would do that, and I applaud them. I have never been charged for my passport, or my discharge book, or my identity card, visas, or my medical certificates. They've always been paid for by my employer when I was at sea and now on the shore. So it's important to reflect on that. There's a nasty underbelly in the shipping industry, and they will always exploit people, seafarers and others. They're not the majority. These statistics from this research are pretty shocking. They caught me by surprise, and we have to deal with it. We have to deal with it determinedly. It starts with the flag states. But let's not forget there's plenty of good ship owners out there who will pay all those costs because they recognize that it's the right thing to do, not to differentiate between shore and sea. And it's what good employers would do. You require them to travel. They need certain documentation to do that. You would not automatically seek to cover it. And we should recognize that. Thanks.
Yeah. I'll just go around and ask a question to each of you before I finish off. And we may finish off a bit early, but that's more time for that delicious breakfast. But we're obviously focusing today on the issue of recruitment fees. This is a global forum for responsible recruitment. There are, of course, a lot of other, human rights risks that seafarers, merchant seamen, that they face, and we touched on some of them. Abandonment, that Ben talked about. Lack of shore leave, which has been an issue for many years, but was exacerbated by the crew change crisis, and in some ways hasn't really corrected itself. So, many years ago you might have gone to sea to see the world, and now you don't. You see your cabin, and you might queue for a week to have your cargo unloaded. You might have an hour and a half on shore where you possibly have a chance to visit a Mission to Seafarers chaplain to talk about issues, and then even if that, in some cases, depending on what terminal you're in, and then you're back out to sea again. And those are just two. There are a lot of them are covered by the Maritime Labour Convention. Those that aren't are covered by the Delivering on Seafarers' Rights Code of Conduct, which we kind of call MLC++, and do have a look at that. And I think part two of the panel will talk about what human rights due diligence opportunities there are. But just before we go to a break, I guess to each of you, and Mark, I'll come to you first. What sort of 2 or 3 measures do you think, and do you think you do want to see ship owners, operators, and importantly for this audience, I think, container cargo owners taking to reduce the risk of the illegal charging of recruitment fees?
Well, look, I think you've touched on what I would have highlighted, and that is the importance of human rights due diligence in the supply chain, asking the questions up and down that supply chain of what conditions the seafarers on the ships that are being used to facilitate the movement of those goods, raw materials, finished products. That's a really, really powerful conversation. ESG, particularly the S. The environment is getting talked about an awful lot. Governance has also been talked about a lot, but the S is still being framed, I think, in the conversation. I'm not sure that everybody. I'm a trustee of a number of pension schemes, and the investment managers throw ESG about demonstrating how they're complying. And I say, well, can you tell me more about the S? And they always stumble. They think, okay, we'll make a donation to the Missions to Seafarers, and that's S covered off.
That's a good thing to do, of course.
That's a very good thing to do, Mark. Yeah.
I'm going to say, if they do, Ben, I'm sure you'd be pleased about it, but when they use it solely as a way of demonstrating that their social conscience has been satisfied, I get very riled.
Yeah.
And you know that has got to be something that's fleshed out. But you know, the ship owners and the unions, when they talk together at the ILO, we pretty much can get through the amendments that we want. So we need the support of the ship owners to enhance those standards. And finally, you said 3, so just let's give me one more minute. Flag states, that's where it all starts. They are the top of the pinnacle. They have to enforce and implement the standards that exist today. They've also got to work with us to improve those standards. We need to eradicate fee charging in whatever way it manifests, those employment scams or those innovative ways in which they cheat poor, unfortunate seafarers. That we've got to double down on that, and they've got a key role to play in this. Thanks, Francesca.
Thanks, Mark. And Ben, if you were to say 2 or 3 things that you'd like to see companies, shipping companies, and their customers.
Yeah, I think Mark has very eloquently summed it up. It does start with flag states. We do need to see much greater transparency. So, you know, there are port state control lists which are publicly available, which talk about the number of times a ship has been arrested. But actually, those should be extended. We should, you know, in an ideal world, I think, you know, maybe a seafarer should have his own or her own individual IMO type of number, where actually that international record follows them around the world. With transparent data about the number of times that they may well have been exploited, so that we can actually do something about that. I think also, though, not underestimating the considerable power that you as cargo owners in this room have in ensuring that there exist on board facilities which safeguard and promote and protect the seafarers' well-being, both physically, mentally, how they got there, how they get home, and that of their families. I've been privileged through the IHRB to talk to a number of cargo owners who are asking those really important questions. And I think, you know, there is only this, the ITF and the unions and the IMO and the ILO is a great place to have that say and to have those debates. But actually the real power, or a significant part of the power, I should say, exists with cargo owners in this room. And so, you know, opening these lines of dialogue, opening these lines of communication is so fundamentally important.
Yeah, I just wanted to add actually back, and I could be wrong on this, Mark, but I do believe the Maritime Labour Convention is the only possibly ILO convention which has inbuilt into it the possibility for periodic updating. Is that right? An improvement?
Yeah, that's right. It's unique in that respect. I mean, we can only amend the code, which is the code A and B. The articles, the chapeau, if you like, of the convention, that can only be amended by a full Labour conference. But the code, the detail, that can be amended.
Yeah. Well, excuse the pun, but hats off to you for getting that one through. And so, Isabel, finally, what 2 or 3 things would you say?
Yeah, I mean, fully agree with Mark and Ben on what's been said. Questioning, I think number 1 is now what we're doing currently is raising the awareness, because as I said, like me having worked in a ship owner, ship manager, I wasn't aware and I would have thought it's not a problem. So I think the first thing is that we really create the awareness. Then secondly, I think also that cargo owners and the cargo will have quite a power. I think the same counts for the finance side. So investors, really like banks, but also financial institutions investing into shipping, have also a great leeway to question and ask things. And I fully agree with Mark on the S. So the S is kind of left out of the ESG. Actually, the ESG. So I think stakeholders definitely who step in, who you like put up questions and who really want to or actually check on how things are done. You know, it's very easy to say, well, it's MLC compliant. No, but I think we need to really check on like that things are really done properly. So this due diligence is not anymore a pure paperwork, but I think it should be a far more interactive and active way, and also tools where you can basically check what is happening and also report much better than you did before. But I think there's a way to go, but I think number 1 is really the awareness.
Thank you. And I think in the second part of this panel, which is possibly going to be a bit too short, we'll hear from, we'll hopefully touch on MSC, which is one of the biggest shipping companies in the world. Oh, brilliant, thank you, thanks. Who've done a pilot project with Coles, which is an Australian supermarket, on adding model clauses to contracts between container cargo owners and their shipping customers. I think we've got a few more questions, so perhaps just come back to Bonnie for the last 5-10 minutes.
All right, so I have the next block of 3 questions, and also there are a lot of questions I think that will come quite well with the next session.
Brilliant.
So I don't want to give you all the questions because I have to
No,
chair the
I think
next one.
that's right. Yeah.
Okay, so for the next 3, I think there's one looking into the details of recruitment fees in the shipping sector. So perhaps this is a very good one for Turtle. So questions like who's charging? Is it the ship owners or is it the agents? And who's paying for training fees? And then there's a question about, are there any positive examples? Are there shipping companies or anyone that stands out in your mind who is receptive to the employer pays principle? So we want some positive examples. And then there's a question about the nationality of the seafarers themselves. Are there different regulations? On a boat, you have people working from different nationalities. How does that affect your push for responsible recruitment? And there's one that I want to get in. I think it's really good for Ben, which is we have one participant who's asking the question of, well, which one is more important to the seafarers in your experience? Is it employer pays principle, or is it better and safer working conditions on the vessels? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Bonnie. So I guess we'll just come, Isabel, if you could answer that first question. Who's doing the charging and who's paying for the training, or who should pay for the training?
Yeah, so that was also one part of the question was who exercised actually the corruption, or who asked the question. And number one is the manning agencies, so it's the local manning agencies, but also there are other mentionings from official authorities, port state, pilot, harbor masters. I mean, that was more in the course of not specifically on the recruitment part, but during the working. Medical practitioners. I think this is also something which I also heard. So when you do your medical, you pay something on top in order to have it like the clean one, or also training institutions. So there are, I think number one is manning agencies, but there's also some other institutions around recruitment or on the operations. It's not the owners themselves. So normally the way is you have the owner, whether the one, actually there's a kind of HRC department, and they have a demand and they go through the local manning agency, and the local manning agency then connects with the seafarers. So it's there where the charge happens.
Yeah, and I think Klaveness, and apologies if I said this towards the beginning, I can't remember, but Klaveness gets over this by owning its own recruitment agencies in Romania and the Philippines. So I guess the positive examples question, I might leave that to the second panel, and any of you, that is about human rights due diligence, and so get your questions in early because it's a shorter panel, and I imagine that's where the questions will be. In terms of how to go about it, but if I could just put that question to you, Mark, about nationalities and how that works.
Yeah, well, my experience and talking and communicating with the ITF in the run-up to this session, just to make sure that my sense of this was correct, is that it absolutely chimes with Turtle's findings, actually. It's absolutely rampant in India, the charging of fees, and I think the stats bear that out in the Turtle research. Ukraine was also mentioned, and Bangladesh in terms of sort of the top 3. And again, I think the stats bear that out. In the spirit of being brief and allowing time for other questions, I think I'll leave it there unless there's any follow-up.
I think that's right, and I think also in terms of nationalities, it meant like if you're on a ship, if you have, a Ukrainian perhaps and a Filipino crew member, what rules prevail, but that would be the flag state of the ship. So the international language of seafarers is English, right? So they all have to speak a certain level of English. Have I got that right, Ben? Is that
It's the
correct?
language of the sea, yeah.
It's the
Yeah, I
language
mean,
of the sea.
sorry, Ben. Yeah.
But then on the ship, the rules will be the International Maritime Labour Convention, as implemented by the flag state of the ship. Yeah. And then, Ben, to you, before we wrap up, what do you think is more important, employer-based principle or safer
I
working?
mean,
I'd say
why
that's
should it be an either or,
Well,
really?
exactly.
I mean, you know, we run something called the Seafarers Happiness Index. Wow, I've been clapped by the union. That's brilliant. That's almost a first. I'll buy you a curry the next time, Mark. We run something called the Seafarers Happiness Index. It's a quarterly barometer of how seafarers feel. We ask them the same 10 questions. It's a self-selecting survey. But that gives us a pretty good indication about how seafarers are feeling at any given time. And we ask them things about shore leave, etc., and how they feel about training and other issues. But the overriding feeling and the overriding thought that constantly comes back from that is that seafarers want to feel respected in their workplace. And there are, as Mark said, there are a great many companies who do respect their seafarers, have a huge amount of EAP programs in place that look after them and indeed their families. Many companies, good companies, will have big family networks that they will support them as well. But it is that level of respect that very often seafarers feel is missing. So it's not an either or in my world. It's an holistic approach,
Yeah.
which touches on that collaboration that we've already talked about.
Yeah. I'll just...
Francesca,
yes.
can I just add something to Ben's excellent
Please do.
intervention there? Well, it shouldn't be an either or, should it? I mean, everything is about the health and safety of the vessel. Anything that compromises the health and safety of the vessel, and I can't imagine how you must feel if you're in debt or you've had to borrow money to secure a job. You're in a position that could even be considered to be, tantamount to forced labour. How does that contribute to the health and safe running of a vessel?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not really about prioritising what we want. It's about that not compromising the efficient and safe operation of the vessel, because if it is compromised, it has horrendous consequences not only for the seafarers but potentially the environment and for the lives of those travelling on the ship. So it's pretty important.
So just in advance of the next session, there is a crew change guidance, which, as I mentioned, Martha from the UN Global Compact may mention. There's a really good case study in there of a brand trying to find out what ships its products were on, what were the collective bargaining agreements on that ship, how it went through that process in order to begin even visibility of to start its human rights due diligence. And it's a short case study, but really, really good. I also did a podcast with her, if you're interested. That's on the IHRB site. And just one last statistic, which is 40 years ago, less than 2% of merchant navy were women, and there have been many, many campaigns since going on, and the figure today is less than 2%. So in some cases it can be difficult to make change in that industry, but we'll keep going. So thanks very much, and we'll see you again shortly for part 2 of this panel. Thank you. And thank you very much to our
It's getting there? All right. She'll come. But I have a very short time with you today. It's even less than the previous panel, so I want to use every minute because we realized the chat all of a sudden, it was like 20 questions. So we want to get to as many of them as possible. So my name is Bonnie Ling. I'm a professional collector of questions, as you saw yesterday and today. And it's a tremendous honor to be here today. I'm a child immigrant to this country. And I couldn't help but, as I'm here in New York, and I was thinking the other day, the poem that's associated with the Statue of Liberty, give me your hungry, give me, what is it? Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. And I just thought maybe she was writing about human rights due diligence, about maritime, right? Work in maritime, because the poem instinctively kind of focus on the misery of that life at sea, but also at the same time, the rest of the poem talk about this dream, of something better. And I think maritime sector for a lot of the seafarers who work is that double-edged reality. So without further ado, I'm joined today by a very distinguished panel. And I hope in a conversation with them, we can draw out some of these points following from panel 1. And then we go in briefly into ports, and then we zoom back out again into transport and logistics. So all that in 55 minutes. So let me introduce my panelists. We have Martha calling in from Germany. Hi, Martha. So Martha Sullivan, she is the UN Global Compact Ocean Manager. She also leads the Just Transition Maritime Task Force, working with IMO, ILO, on these very important issues. We have Christopher Saunders calling in from Singapore. Hi, that doesn't look like nighttime in Singapore. But it's very nice to see you. Christopher is here today as the Chief Product Officer for RightShip. There was a very long question on RightShip in the chat, so you can take that question straight away. RightShip provides due diligence service on all the issues we talked about previously in the first panel. And he will talk us through some of the tools that they have developed on human rights due diligence in this area. And then we have Doug Nystrom. He is the Associate Director for North America for Impact. And I don't feel like I need to introduce you because I think you know a lot of people in this room in your previous capacity as working with Walmart to push for the responsible recruitment agenda. So it is absolutely an honor to have this panel, and let's start straight away. I would like to start, we're in the post-COVID world, right? But I think, Martha, for your presentation, for your remarks, I think it's important that we go back to the times of COVID, right? And so you can talk to us about what was the crew change crisis? What were the circumstances that drove the UN Global Compact in collaboration with the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, the IMO, to look at producing some type of guidance to help us deal with the unprecedented challenges. So Martha, if I could just give you the floor for the next 10 minutes and we can do a quick Q&A back and forth. Thank you, yes. Martha.
Certainly. Well, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And of course, my apologies, I can't be with you in person. If it's a bit bright here, it's because I'm currently in London and not Germany, where it's very hot. So great to see you all. So yes, great question. And let's start from the perspective of COVID. And I think, as with many sectors and industries, COVID shone a light on a number of things that weren't going well in our societies. And I think in this case, it's no different. So just to recap what was happening during the pandemic, as we're all very aware, as it affected all of us in some way, shape or form, there are a number of travel bans, government-imposed travel bans, and of course this had a huge impact on seafarers, who of course are often from different nationalities and having to travel from different ports to one another. And at the sort of high point of such of the crew change crisis, around up to 300,000 seafarers were actually impacted. And by that I mean couldn't get off the ship, but also couldn't get on the ship as well. So this was really sort of negatively impacting their sort of basic human and labour rights. And as Mark already mentioned in our sort of first panel, was also infringing on aspects of the Maritime Labour Convention, including, for instance, being deprived of your annual leave, but also other kinds of sort of fatigue, physical and mental health issues, and of course, critically, working beyond the terms agreed in their employment agreements. I think some seafarers were even on board for 17 months. And of course, under the Maritime Labour Convention, it should be around 11 months. So really, you know, lots of infringements happening in that respect. Now, we know, of course, as I already mentioned, that, you know, a lot of these travel bans, et cetera, were coming from government. So they were really being, you know, led from that kind of, you know, political perspective. And of course, as we know, under the UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights, you know, it is ultimately down to governments who have the core responsibility to protect human rights, and they should have done more, and we know that. However, of course, companies, businesses across the supply chain under our UN Guiding Principles also have, you know, the responsibility to respect human rights. And what we were increasingly seeing at UN Global Compact, but also more generally in the ecosystem, was that not only were governments not upholding their responsibilities with respect to letting seafarers on and off board, but a number of charterers and cargo owners were increasingly exerting pressure along the supply chain across the other direction, and essentially saying that they didn't want crew changes because crew changes took an additional 2 weeks. And of course, they're driven by sort of time constraints. And they were actually exerting pressure on the shipping community not to undertake these routine crew changes. So at that moment, we really, you know, recognized that there was a real need to undertake some kind of business advocacy and education to ensure that that kind of additional pressure from the supply chain wasn't already exacerbating a humanitarian crisis. So that is basically the backdrop to our UN Global Compact and Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is what we call our call to business action, which we launched, and essentially called on companies across the global supply chain to conduct human rights due diligence in this, instance of crisis, and of course to utilize their leverage on governments and other maritime transport providers. But interestingly, you know, as the UN, we love a call to action and a joint statement. But one of the sort of feedbacks that we got from a number of companies was, well, you know, how do we do that? How do I conduct human rights due diligence? Like, what does this actually look like? And we really realized that there was very little awareness, if at all, across, you know, really large companies, cargo owners, who one would have thought would have this on their radar. So we realized that that kind of call to action wasn't enough. And we actually had to kind of get into the nitty gritty of what the practical actions would actually be, both for a charterer and a cargo owner, to actually undertake human rights due diligence in this specific instance. So that was kind of how our human rights due diligence tool was born, that you already sort of made reference to. And it really does try and outline practical actions that cargo owners and charterers can take, you know, both from, and Francesca already mentioned this, and the great case of TGF Brands, you know, how they then went out and liaised with their transport partners, sought written assurances from their suppliers that their expectations with respect to seafarers' rights were being upheld, of course, liaising with the International Transport Workers Federation. So what we try to do in this tool, and perhaps I'll have a moment to talk a little bit more about it in another round, is really try, and I think it was the first sort of go at this, to outline practically what cargo owners and charterers needed to do in this situation. And as said, I think the kind of key takeaway as such from that was it just was not on the radar of so many companies before. And of course, as we know, shipping and of course the wider transport logistics network is an integral part of every company's supply chain. And of course, under the UN Guiding Principles, you have a responsibility to workers along that supply chain. So COVID really shone a light on that. And I think, you know, with incoming legislation and things that we're going to talk about, I'm sure in another round, this is only going to get more heightened.
Well, thank you so much for that brief overview, Martha. I would urge everyone to read the guidance because it is very well written. And moreover, I was really struck, and my colleague, Francesca, mentioned this as well. it is backed by a very well-written case study on why TGF got involved in looking at crew change, right? So you spoke of there's very low awareness, but there was a case study of a brand who was very honest, very open about how they were starting with zero. They didn't know the issue, but they felt upon hearing all these stories of they call it humanitarian disaster in the making, a lot of mental suffering on the seafarers who were stranded and couldn't get off the vessels, that they wanted to do something. So they started with zero. They were quite honest about where they started. So can I ask you, how do we get more companies to embark on this journey, knowing that the starting point is zero, but that is okay. That is where we're from.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. And as always, there are a number of sort of push and pull factors. So, of course, we have to start in some respect with legislation. And I'm sure as many in the room are more aware than probably I am in some respects, there is, of course, an increasing rise in sort of supply chain due diligence legislation coming out of Europe, coming out of the US, coming out of other parts of the world. Of course, in Europe, you have another challenge, sort of more of a patchwork approach to different kinds of legislations. But with the new EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, nice short word there, of course, there will be extended requirements under EU law to look at your broader value chain. And of course, that does include shipping and that does include logistics. So there'll certainly be more impetus from that kind of legislative angle to actually undertake some of these sort of human rights due diligence processes that are so needed. And of course, as Mark mentioned, on that other side, of course, accelerated by legislation, there is an increasing demand from financial actors and the sort of broader community to undertake better ESG practices. And of course, this kind of human rights due diligence within supply chains falls within that radar. And I'm not going to in any way contradict Mark. I think what he said is true, but we do know what the S is to an extent, and it's human rights due diligence. We know how to handle it. We know what the processes are. We know how to undertake a risk assessment. So yes, of course, what the S is will depend, but we do have the measures and the processes in place, and we shouldn't use that as an excuse not to do anything about the S. And I think, as I said, there is increasing focus on this. And as I said, we do have the tools to enable us to do that. So, as always, it will be a combination of, legislation, but also, actors wanting to do better with respect to their ESG practices, also to support gaining new kinds of finances, like sustainable finance, and all these kinds of things. And I think one thing I'll just end on in that respect, Ben, here to support what Mark mentioned about, what we see in other sectors is that leaders in sustainability, we want to go beyond compliance, right? Compliance is like the baseline. And, we're now looking at what do I do in addition to what I should do? And I think we need to think about that in the context of the Maritime Labour Convention because, yes, that is the baseline, that's the minimum standard, but actually what should we be doing beyond that and what should leaders in sustainability in the S be doing to increase and add on to what is only really a minimum standard?
Thank you, Martha. So I have one more minute. So I want to just quickly add the question of what else is out there besides the UN Global Compact guidance on human rights due diligence for maritime? Are you aware of to help companies who are embarking on this aspect of their human rights due diligence process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, of course, I'm sure Francesca has mentioned this throughout, but Institute for Human Rights in Business and the Sustainable Shipping Initiative have their code of conduct. And of course, their whole network, who I would say have added, fantastically to the baseline, which really was just a COVID-related human rights due diligence tool. So that really is, as I see it, the thing to help as things stand. Of course, we know, and this is mentioned throughout the discussion, that kind of collaboration in multi-stakeholder coalitions and working groups really is so helpful and important because we are all learning. And I think we'll be learning even more so with respect to, being able to uphold some of these new requirements that are coming for many companies. So engaging, I have to plug the UN Global Compact, of course, in our peer learning groups on decent work. These are all things that will really help, to move the needle. And one thing I would also add is, I'm really impressed, and I'm not just saying this because Mark's here, with the work of the International Transport Workers Federation in this, in this field. When you now look at the next stage of TGF brand's journey, they've actually now partnered with the ITF, and they are now actually engaging in an MOU whereby the ITF is doing, basically a due diligence assessment across their entire logistics chain and obtaining verifiable data for the company to make sure that they are mitigating and responding to any risks. So that is a really, we know that unions and workers are one of the most important stakeholders when it comes to human rights due diligence. So to see that leadership and almost activist position and opportunity to partner and collaborate with the ITF to actually gain the data that you need, I think is really, really reassuring. And they're also looking at this with respect to road transport and, of course, all the other sectors that they cover. So partnering, using active stakeholders, and, of course, engaging in multi-stakeholder coalitions are where I would recommend starting.
Wow, great. So you set up the scene really well for our next panelists. Thank you so much, Martha. So Christoph, you're calling in from Singapore. And I think you can speak about this collaboration that Martha talked about. You've been working with IHRB and on this assessment code of conduct going above what's listed in the Maritime Labour Convention. So over to you.
Good evening from Singapore, and thank you for having me join. I think, lots of great work going on in this space. I think, Francesca, there were some slides we were going to run through. I'm not sure if they're available for the audience there at the moment or not. But essentially what we were going to run through was a little bit about one of those collaborations, so the work we've done with SSI and IHRB around that code of conduct on seafarers' rights. But I was going to start maybe recognizing that a lot of the audience is sort of new to Maritime, just sort of introducing RightShip and the work we do. So we're the world's leading third-party maritime due diligence organization. We were actually set up by BHP, Rio Tinto and Cargill to manage the due diligence requirements of themselves. And we've been going sort of 22 years in that space. What's, I think, really interesting with RightShip is the people within the organization. So we've probably got enough ex-seafarers working within the business to crew 2 or 3 container vessels, for example. I'm an ex-mariner myself, so we bring that sort of domain expertise and knowledge and understanding of what's really going on board the vessels. And we couple that with the sort of data and the information that some of the panelists earlier in the session talked about. So there's a wealth of information out there in terms of port state control data, information on incidents that take place in the industry that can lead and give you information around crew well-being, factors that can be a trigger in that. Also physical inspections of the vessels themselves, and there's many parties doing these, and we conduct our own across vessels. And again, that gives you a really good opportunity where you're seeing firsthand the conditions on board the vessel. So we bring that all together in terms of a digital platform where that sort of insight and intelligence can be leveraged. Francesca, I think we can move on to the next slide. So we're just going to sort of introduce that sort of collaborative work we did with SSI, and that was around the code of conduct and the self-assessment tool itself. And I think really that links into what Mark introduced around the Maritime Labour Convention and the fact that it's really a minimum standard. And the working group we had, we really looked at this and looked at what more can be done in the space for crew welfare and crew well-being. And with that, we looked to sort of craft out a sort of best practice guide, essentially, for ship owners and operators to refer to in terms of those next steps they wanted to take to improve the livelihood of the crew they were employing. And that looks across a range of areas, but it allows them to sort of make a gap analysis and to then look at ways to continually improve year on year. And increasingly now we're 1.5 years into that initiative. the data that then presents to us, I think, is now becoming increasingly valuable to charterers and cargo owners and brands in terms of giving that insight in terms of those vessels and companies that you may be doing business with. So if we go on to the next slide, we've got a few just very high-level stats in terms of the data that we've collected so far and the companies that have contributed. So on the left of the slide there, we've got the sort of the key areas which I think will resonate with everyone today, and particularly the fair terms of employment. So that very much looks at the recruitment policies, forced labour, the payment of fees, but also goes beyond that in terms of basic, intermediate and advanced levels of best practice in this space. In terms of submissions, we've seen really good traction across the industry in this first year and a half. We've got 270 sort of document of compliance holders for the vessels. So these are the owners and operators that really have influence in terms of the safety and crew welfare standards on board those vessels. So that's representing nearly 7,000 vessels, and then we sort of estimate that probably is a coverage at around 250,000 seafarers when you take into account crew changes and rotation on board those vessels. So I think really great progress. And I think what's important to highlight at this stage is that this is all from owners and operators wanting to take that step to improve the standards on board their vessels. This is a voluntary self-assessment to look at their current practices and to use the tool as ways to improve. And of course, if we leverage what Ben spoke about in terms of the power of cargo owners and charterers to really start to increase the pressure on owners and operators, I think we can see contributions to initiatives like this and many others picking up because there really is that power in the hand of the cargo owner. And we've seen that, certainly from RightShip side in other areas in terms of safety and sustainability, that putting in place in terms of charter parties requirements, it is very effective and it does drive change in the industry. Francesco, I think we can move on. This next slide, we just talk about a little bit in terms of how RightShip can help and I guess around sort of increasing transparency of this. So we're really excited to be launching a free tool where any company can register, sign up, and have access in the coming month. In terms of any vessel or company in the world, you can search them. You can look at the crew welfare status in terms of whether they have completed the self-assessment or not, but also other key information that talks to sort of human rights standards. So whether there are any cases of abandonments of seafarers, which again, the earlier panel touched on. I think since 2001, over 10,000 seafarers have been abandoned. Of course, thankfully, this is relatively rare events and it's on the tail end of the shipping, but I think it just highlights the risks that are out there. And, it's really critical that you know who you're dealing with. You've got that insight, intelligence to be making the right decisions and understanding, your risks and managing that. So there's a QR code there. I think we've shared it as well. So please, do make use of that. We want to share that insight and information, make that available, be as transparent as possible in terms of those who are contributing. And start your journey in terms of filling in some of those knowledge gaps in terms of the information that sits out there. But thank you. I'll hand over, Bonnie. I'm sure you've got some follow-up questions.
I do. I have more questions for you. So you speak of how thank you, Christopher, for that. So I have three things. So let's see how far we get in the next 5 minutes. So you speak about making it free, right, to ship owners to use. But how do you, even with it being free, how do you encourage more to use it, to self-assess? And then and I also want to give you a hard one. verification. I think in some ways it shares similarities with the global compacts, where the companies produced a report that is put up on the web, and it talks about their adherence to the 10 principles, but it's not checked, it's no oversight. So let's start with there. How do we get more people to use it, and who verifies?
Yes, absolutely. So I think it's been remarkable, I think, in terms of the work and the coverage that's been achieved so far. And as I say, that's really down to proactive submissions. Of course, there's been leverage. I think there's some really good examples in terms of some of the big charterers really buying into this initiative, and some were part of the working group in terms of forming it up. So that has certainly helped, and I think we'll, as Mark and Ben touched on, I think that we'll only continue to see a larger adoption of these sorts of best practices and initiatives. It's the pressure from that sort of demand side. We're seeing big charterers building it into their sort of human rights declarations. I think one of our shareholders very publicly has put that forward amongst many other initiatives in terms of what they're doing. And I think we're seeing partnerships in terms of people pairing up with companies that are doing the right thing and rewarding that. And I think that ultimately is the key here. There has to be that recognition and reward to encourage more to be doing the right thing and going beyond that minimum standard. And from RightShip's side, that's certainly where we see this. Making that visible and available within the platform against a vessel or a company. We really want to be able to reward those that are doing the right thing and are going the extra mile. Of course, the self-assessment is just the starting point, as you correctly say, Bonnie. There's got to be that governance around it. There's got to be that verification if we're truly going to use this and trust it completely. There's a lot of work going on in that space, and very much so. I think, again, the demand has to be there from the charterers, from the cargo owners, that's something that they want, they require. And we need to have that, being written into contracts that there's a demand that they, the people that you're using, the companies, the vessels that you're utilizing, that they are signing up to initiatives like this, and they are becoming verified in terms of their declarations. From RightShip's side, we're performing verifications through physical inspections on board vessels, and also through physical audits going to the management company's offices, and working through their submission, looking at their practices, but also in terms of working with organizations like Turtle and others that, understanding who they're working with, what ship managers, what ship owners are utilizing their services. And again, that gives you an assurance that the right measures are being taken in areas such as recruitment. So I think there's a lot of work going on in this space, but there's an awful lot more that can be done and needs to be done. But it's exciting to see it progressing.
Thank you for that, Christopher. And I see that I have 1 minute, so I want to squeeze this in. So what about the role of workers' voice? What do you do with that in terms of planning ahead for the next stage? What's coming? Do you engage with unions at ports? Do you, what is the role they play in what you spoke about for verification and transparency? That would be my last question, then we move to Doug.
Sure, yeah. No, so we've got an exciting piece of work underway at the moment, again with the same working group that sort of formed the self-assessment and the code of conduct in the first place. And we'll be reaching out through that working group to other industry players as well to contribute. And that's very much focused in revising the crew welfare standard and the content that's within it, leveraging the learnings that have been now that we're a year and a half in, taking feedback, understanding again where MLC, for example, has had revisions, where we've seen charterers, cargo owners making further requests and demands. And introducing that sort of governance process in terms of a verification standard, and again that will be published out to the market. And then making that sort of verified or unverified data, again, freely available so that all stakeholders in the industry can start to make use of that. Of course, that's in a collaborative way. I think the likes of ITF, ICS, many others are involved in the process. And you know, for it to really be successful, it thrives on that sort of level of involvement.
Well, thank you very much for that, Christopher. I hope in the Q&A we can come back and pick up on some of the threads. But now, in the interest of time, let's move on to our last panelist. And I was teasing Doug earlier before the panel. I said, I'm going to throw it to him, and he's going to tell us how to fix it, you know, in his 10 minutes. But okay, so I was only half joking because I would like for us to end up somewhere in that direction towards the end of our discussion. But let me just ask you, from your long experience of working on human rights issues in supply chain, do you think there has been sufficient attention given to the shipping sector?
No. We can end it right there.
Okay, all right.
First of all, I feel like I'm a short person amongst giants here because of my experience in this area. Makes me feel like my extent has been paddling around a kayak amidst all these big ships. But I would say no. There hasn't been enough attention on it. And I think that IHRB and these organizations putting a spotlight on it is really helpful. But it also causes some angst, you know, for businesses. I think, if you think about how businesses have approached supply chains and responsibility in supply chains, they started with tier 1, tier 2, what they buy, what's manufactured, what's sold them. Now they're being told they got to go to tier 3, raw materials. You got to do it. So you're going down that train of thought, and then you got to throw in, we got these recruiters over here that we got to start monitoring just in that product supply chain, which that's another element of complexity. Now you're like, we got to look at all the shipping now.
Yeah, and let's talk about value chain, right?
And I'm going to say that's a whole nother discussion internally, because that's a different department within companies. That's your logistics, your transport. It's not the same contracts, and so I think there has to be discussions internally. I'm trying to jump to solutions, I guess, quickly, but. As I think it through, companies need to have your human rights people talking to the logistics people now. Your lawyers for the logistics are going to be different from the lawyers that were for your compliance or for your corporate affairs or whatever it is. So you're going to have to involve different lawyers now. And I think that because those contracts with freight are different than your master service agreements with suppliers. And so you're going to have to embed these standards, and the standards for suppliers you might have aren't necessarily going to be in those freight contracts. And so I think you've got to start with embedding it in those. So sorry, I'm jumping to the solutions. I'm just trying to help you think through why this hasn't been focused on, I think, yet, because it's an aspect of the supply chain that is very different from what companies have been focusing on.
No, I think it's a valid point, and I think it reflects the general observation that logistics and transport team, typically in a company, are not usually there on a discussion, on human rights due diligence. Right. So why is that, and how do we bring them into this important discussion? Because this is where all these issues that Christopher mentioned, that Martha mentioned on human rights due diligence, that's where we can start looking at risks in transportation.
I think it's just the way companies are. You've got to segment and specialize. The specialists are over here for transport and logistics. Your buyers and merchants are over here. So it's just the way it is. So you've got to have a matrixed approach to this within an organization. And it's not, they've not necessarily been part of the equation when it comes to human rights. So they're going to have to get educated. They're going to have to be brought up to speed where everybody else in the company might be on the same page. And I think that's where highlighting it, like IHRB does, allows those people to have those conversations internally. And I think if you can have more stories of what somebody has gone through, like Ben could supply, that gives information that you can take back into your company and say, this is what's going on. And then I think, if you're trying to do this internally, you got to start looking at risk. Where is the risk? You can't tackle everything. And so as a company, okay, let's kind of map out the risk here. Which lines, which freight companies are more risky? Does it depend on where the flag state is? These flags of convenience seem, in my mind as a lawyer, seem to go like, okay, if I want to skirt the system, I might go to, let's pick a country that I think is is not very restrictive, and I'm going to go with that as a ship. And so something's got to be done around there. So I mean, this is a whole ball of wax. I think this is huge.
Yes, a whole ball of wax.
And I think it's going to take, the spotlight. It's going to take business. Whether you've chartered or cargo owner or importer, it's going to take that as demand we've heard. I think is important. It's going to take, those actual owners of the ships doing it. And then I think there's a whole public policy piece to this that has to be done, advocacy, and how do you advocate in Panama when you've got, okay, that might be where the flag state is, but you've got a bunch of people from the Philippines, so you're going to have to advocate for changes in Panama, perhaps, be more restrictive, or maybe they need more resources, or the ports need resources, and then you're going to have to advocate for maybe policy changes within the Philippines. You got to be more restrictive of the manning in the manpower part of it.
I'm kind of smiling a bit because panel 1 opened with this short introduction about how complicated it is. We're looking at flag state, we're looking at port state, and then not to mention all these jurisdiction issues. Law of the sea typically is not an easy law class, for these reasons where you have different overlapping jurisdictions, you have nationality of the seafarers, you have a ship that can be divided and bought up by different people, you can have ports that are divided and different people own it. So it is complicated. So I think that is a barrier, to a lot of people trying to understand the maritime sector, how complicated it is. And I think you mentioned very, very rightfully so, the regulation, right? Internationally, nationally, it is a very mixed picture. I mean, I am astounded by the fact that UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, if you look at slavery, they prohibit the transportation of slavery. So the question is, okay, so is the use okay?
Right.
So I think the people tend to feature very weakly in a lot of these international discourses on ocean governance, and we need to change that because we see the effect of that trickling down to the national level. So you spoke of the power of stories, and I think going back to what Martha said about the due diligence briefing produced by the Global Compact, it was that. The case study they used was, it started with the company hearing about the tremendous the unfolding humanitarian disaster for crew that was stranded, and they wanted to take action, and they fed that to the board, and there we're seeing all that ripple effects, that Martha spoke about. So I think that is indeed very, very powerful. So let's move the discussion a little bit to your idea of solutions. So where do we start? You alluded to groups like this, where we, multi-stakeholder initiatives. Is contract an option? Should these clauses be inserted into contracts like Christopher suggested?
Yeah, I think so. I think if you want to protect yourself as a company, you better put some of these in there. As you have a freight contract, especially if you're going to charter vessels, which was popular during COVID because of the supply chain issues. You're a step closer to the conduct, and you're a little more. You're always responsible, but you're a little closer to that responsibility. And so if you didn't have something in there in a contract, you're very exposed, if you didn't. And so, I mean, that's the first step in the OECD due diligence is embed it in your management systems, get it in the contracts, and that's what everybody has done. Companies have done with standards for suppliers. I mean, they put those in the contracts. Well, these are different contracts now, and we've got to make sure that the same type of thing, the code of conduct that we've been talking about, is probably in those as well.
Okay, so contracts,
Yeah.
that's one thing. more awareness around the stories of the negative impacts, human rights impacts, the high recruitment fees that we looked at in panel 1. Let's look at some of the other solutions. What about ports? What can port authorities do? They're the linchpin. You know, if we look at maritime transport and transport on land, should we ask more of port authorities? What are their due diligence procedures? I can say that I actually looked up the Freeport documents that the UK government is proposing, just to see what were their provisions on human rights, and I don't think I found any, you know? So how do we change this whole ecosystem where, again, the people do not feature in issues of governance in these talks of trade?
Yeah, Ben mentioned earlier about inspection and monitoring being, filling those holes in the ports and getting that done, you know, and it really might be that there's a lack of resources. You know, I don't really know in the ports. Yeah. And so it may be that there needs to be some input of extra resources, whether it's, you know, another country, USAID helping kind of, for example, or DFID helping to actually build up the resources of those ports. I mean, that may be a solution to that.
I see our online panelists nodding. Can I ask you for some of your thoughts? Martha, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. Sorry, I was nodding. No, I mean, I was nodding and thinking because, I mean, ports, sorry to bring more complexity into it, but of course ports are also incredibly complex. You have public ports, you have private ports, so their kind of entry points into action will be quite different. With respect to privately owned ports, of course, that same kind of logic with respect to rising ESG, all these kind of things may apply to them, and that we see ports already having certain sort of measures in place for ships visiting ports with respect to their GHG emissions or green credentials. So one could assume that something similar might be done with respect to human labour rights. But once again, with a publicly owned port, they will also, in some ways, have more responsibility to actually do something about this. So once again, it is complex, and the entry point and the leverage that each port will have will be very different compared, you know, some are also public-privately owned, for instance, as well. So I think that's also something to navigate. But as I said, each of those actors will then have different reasons for taking action on this, and a number of them are with respect to environment, so there should be no reason why this cannot be included.
So be mindful of the complexities and look at building up capacity for port authorities, to, you know, and going back to Martha's point about, you know, knowing that these are complex settings, but we need to identify our points of leverage. Christoph, you were nodding, so can we have your thoughts and then we move to the floor?
I mean, I think we've seen firsthand, we work with ports and terminals as well. And I think the challenge in that space, as Martha alluded to, is obviously for charterers, there's that kind of go, no-go decision making option in terms of the contracts. Often with the ports, you're receiving a vessel. Of course, if there's grave concerns there, then there's options in terms of rejecting the vessels or detaining them or excluding them. But often, you know, you don't know so much around the vessel until it gets in, and that harm or that problem is already within your port. So I think the role of the ports, terminals, that sort of space is really around reporting when issues are detected. I think we leverage a sort of feedback reporting mechanism with the ports and terminals that use our platform. And it's a really, really valuable tool. They're on board the vessels. They're able to flag, you know, where there are welfare concerns. They're often even inspecting the vessels. Now, that can be port state control inspections, which are obviously official, but there can be more informal inspections being done just at, you know, the terminal operators, the loading masters, the pilot even boarding the vessel to help safely navigate the vessel in. These are all touch points where you know, we've got to sink into that and be able to capture data from that to then be able to take action and to be able to, you know, stamp down on the offenders and ultimately stop them being able to trade. I think that's the key here, is about I talked about earlier about recognizing those who are going beyond the minimum standards and rewarding that. I think at the same time, those that are found to be guilty, those of it to be found to breaching basic human rights and those minimum standards, we've got to restrict them in terms of being able to do that harm again.
Thank you so much, Christopher. So many interesting points. You speak of, inspections, penalties. Shall we take questions and see where the discussions go? I'm just very mindful of time because the next panel is on child labor in the US, and I don't want to steal any minute from that. All right, Francesca.
Yeah, so I don't know, is this microphone on?
No.
It's my first time. Bonnie's the pro here. So a couple of questions just coming in about fishing vessels, and as I mentioned in the first panel, unfortunately, we'd love to touch on the issue of responsible recruitment there, but we don't have the time for that today. So I guess 3 questions, one of which you've sort of answered, and I'll just ask all 3, and then you can tackle them. But in terms of enforcement and inspections, should brands be paying for inspections more? What more can be done around inspections? Should there be more advocating to get that more off the ground? In terms of the self-assessment, does it pick up on the most sensitive issues for seafarers? And then rounding back again to just look at the issues of responsible recruitment, are there any cases of sending governments taking responsibility around seafarers who've either due diligence in terms of remedy or in terms of preventing it happening in the first place? And I guess that reminds me also of the question that I didn't come to in the first panel that you mentioned, Bonnie, about positive examples of shipping companies addressing the issues of recruitment fees in their staff.
Wow. Thank you so much. I think the most obvious is, Christoph, you take the question on self-assessment. We spoke a little bit about enforcement and inspection, but I wonder whether or not, Martha, you can take that. And then we go back to responsible recruitment and Doug. Yeah, how does that sound? And then we'll wrap up promptly. Okay, Christoph, your turn. Self-assessment. Does that pick up the most sensitive issues?
Yeah, I think the question was around, does it pick up, yes, the most sensitive issues? So I think, yes, it does. It's been constructed certainly with quite a breadth in terms of what it looks to cover. So everything from those recruitment practices that we spoke about and have heard an awful lot about, well-being on board, provisions of access to Wi-Fi, the quality and quantity of food, recreation equipment, payment of wages, support in terms of mental health, healthcare. I think all those sort of key items that Mark spoke really well about in terms of what you would expect in any shore-based job, which sometimes is not actually provided on board vessel. So I think absolutely it does. However, it's not in isolation. I think there's plenty of work going on in the industry. There's lots of innovation. There's lots of tools that contribute to doing even more. And the self-assessment is about highlighting some of those and promoting them and making suggestions that, in best practice. For example, engaging directly with the seafarers that you're employing to pulse check how they're feeling, to check in on their mental health, to provide them more support in what is often a challenging job where you're away from your family, and we heard about some of those stresses and challenges. So I think no tool or solution is there in isolation. There's many initiatives. The ITF doing a lot of work as well, and I think they're all fantastic and have a role to play.
Thank you very much. So Martha, you work for the UN Global Compact. So tell us, how can we improve, enforcement and the actual implementation of the MLC?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, even though, yes, UN Global Compact, we work with companies, but I'm going to chuck it a bit back to our member state friends here, because we know that the ultimate enforcement of the Maritime Labour Convention does rest with governments to some extent. And here, of course, during COVID, we saw that a lot of what they were supposed to be enforcing, they didn't. So I think, there's lots of lessons to be learned there to how we can ensure that governments and authorities actually enforce what they've signed up to under the Maritime Labour Convention. And I know there are a lot of lessons to be learned in that respect from COVID. I see Mark nodding. I don't know if you can all see it, but I can. So there's a lot to learn there. But maybe just, moving also away from the role of authorities to enforce the MLC, I think, there's another role for legislation here, which is, as I mentioned, there's obviously now this increased scrutiny on sort of supply chain due diligence, risk assessment, and we know that under the incoming legislation in the European Union, for instance, that there will be a need for companies to verify what it is they're saying that they're doing. And that, of course, is another mechanism of enforcing what companies say they're doing in that respect. So I think, once again, using those kind of legislative pull factors will be important. And then, it's already been mentioned by Chris, but of course, when it comes to the verification aspect, the ITF is doing, great work in that respect, being able to actually inspect the vessels. But of course, in order to be inspected, you need to have that collective bargaining agreement in the first place. So a way to enforce is also to engage through collective bargaining, to engage with the unions. And that will be, another, one of the most important ways to ensure that what you are expecting of your suppliers is actually coming into fruition.
Thank you, Martha. So I think we return back to a standard question when it comes to responsible recruitment, which is how can we get states to drive the solutions and actually implement the responsible recruitment model, not just for seafarers, but across, and make it the standard. So Doug, how do we do that?
How do we get states,
2 minutes.
The countries?
Yes, exactly, sending
yeah.
states, but I think it's equal, right? All states.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And this is what the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment's been fighting for a while. How do you get these governments to actually change and actually have a responsible recruitment mindset, regulating the manpower agencies that are sending the workers out, protecting them. It's going to take multiple engagements. It's going to take brands and businesses coming together and saying this is the way it should be. It's going to take these vessel owners. It's going to take organizations like we've had today kind of coming together, and it's going to have to be a collective effort to try to pick and choose. Okay, I think let's pick the ones that are kind of the worst actors here, and let's go engage them. I think that's the key. But it can't just be one company or one entity going to talk to them. And then it's got to be other governments kind of putting pressure as well through things, and through their aid development or through trade status, things like that.
Yes, so...
It's not a quick solution. Sorry.
Yeah, where's that checklist, Doug?
Yeah.
Very true. So we have 1 minute, and I feel like we're just starting, right? We can talk for another hour, I think. But, and we should keep talking, right? That's the message here for the group. We're just at the beginning of the journey for human rights due diligence in shipping. But the greater goal is to change it to a system where responsible recruitment is the norm. It's not exceptional, it's just the way it is. So let's bring that into reality. So in the last minute, I would like to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists and also for the participants calling in online. I know a lot of people from Asia are calling in. They were very excited about the shipping day focused. So thank you so much. All right.
start off with a panel like this saying it's a pleasure to moderate a panel like this, but unfortunately this is a really heavy topic, talking about the links between child labor and forced labor here in the United States, the world's richest country. And I think what we're going to do today is try to, in just the space of an hour, use the resources and expertise of a really terrific panel we have here, made up of civil society advocates, data providers, business experts, and other service providers, to help all of us better understand the nature of this challenge here in the United States, but more importantly, to also focus not just on where this risk is and try to begin to approach this problem of child labor and recruitment abuse in the United States as something that's new and something that people have to sort out whether or not they're associated with it, but rather to face it squarely as a deep and systemic problem. That's not just something that happens to be noted by a New York Times reporter in February, Hannah Dreier. I'm hoping that many of you have read her expose, Finding Children 11, 12, I think even 10 years old, deep in American supply chains. This is a deep systemic problem that's not just a matter of a quirk in either a Trump or Biden administration border policy approach, but rather something that's deeply embedded in American supply chains. And I think it's important with a group like this that has focused for many years on recruitment abuse and the links of forced labor to acknowledge how, even though it's easy for us or typical for groups to focus on adults, whether they're the seafarers we've been hearing about this morning or adult workers who are migrating to, say, Qatar and facing death by heat in the desert or facing years and years of paying off their debt to get out of bondage, that many children are also migrants with their parents, but often alone. That's certainly the case here in the United States, and we need to acknowledge that. And so it's really important to have this time to expand our notion of forced labor, to see how it's connected to some other fundamental abuses and labor rights like freedom from child labor, in addition to issues around conditions of work or freedom from discrimination. That's more common for us to talk about in these fora. It's great that we do have all of our panelists in person, and so hopefully that'll make it a little bit easier for everybody, and certainly for our colleagues who deal with the complicated tech issues of having a global online forum. But I did also just wanted to note it was really powerful yesterday when Maritza courageously talked about the situation she faced here in the United States as a young person, but as an adult. And obviously, we really need to acknowledge the fact that the children here in the United States who have been victims of these abuses and forced labor cannot and should not be able to speak for themselves, right? It'd be totally inappropriate to do that, and frankly, it would be very hard to find them. And so I just really wanted to really acknowledge the fact that we're dealing with a really heavy topic here, where we're not really even able to hear from the victims of this crime themselves. But we do have experts who can help us illuminate what the issue is and help us think through how to approach it. So what I'm going to do with our time is ask each of our panelists to just first briefly introduce themselves, help you see where their organization is focused as a resource provider or expert on this issue of child and forced labor in the United States, just very briefly. Then we're going to have each panelist talk about how they see in ways that their organization is approaching some of these deep structural problems related to recruitment and child labor and forced labor in the US. Then we're going to ask them to provide some insights into remedy and justice and remediation and how to deal particularly with child victims in these circumstances. And then finally, some recommendations around public policy advocacy, particularly by companies. And then hopefully we'll have some time for questions. So why don't I first start with Diana Fimbres from the Polaris Project.
Thank you, Sean. Hi, everyone. As Sean mentioned, I am the Senior Program Manager for the Strategic Initiative on Labor Trafficking at Polaris. Polaris is an anti-trafficking organization that works to shift the systems that allow sex and labor trafficking to occur in North America, and we also operate the National Human Trafficking Hotline. On the labor trafficking team in particular, we're focused on ending the labor trafficking of migrant guest workers in the United States with a particular focus in the agricultural sector.
Great. We've met Rachel Michael-Jones yesterday from CDM, but Rachel, it would be great to hear a little more about how CDM orients towards this issue.
Okay, great. So I'm Rachel Michael-Jones, and I'm the founder and executive director of Centro de los Derechos del Migrante, or CDM, the Center for Migrant Rights. And we work in Mexico and the United States to support migrant worker organizing and advocacy. We're really trying to build worker power, remove the border as a barrier to justice for workers, and fight for an alternative model to labor migration that respects workers, their communities, their families. And we do that with partners too, like Polaris and other members of Migration That Works, which is a coalition that CDM chairs. And with respect to child labor, at CDM, we've always seen cases of child labor, but usually in agriculture, and even in the H-2A program, there are minors who are recruited to work in agriculture. But more recently, we've seen cases in protein processing industries in the Delmarva Peninsula, in the automotive industry in the South, where we have cases. And so I think what we're seeing at our organization really mirrors kind of the data that we're seeing from the Department of Labor and others about the increase in child labor. And I think our approach at CDM is always really to provide a base of support to workers, ensure that there's a safety plan and a security plan in place, and that we're not putting people at risk when we approach these cases. So look forward to the next round.
Thank you. Also wanted to introduce Malin Lingert from the Center for Child Rights in Business, who's a global expert on child labor and the remediation of that.
Thank you so much, Sean, and thanks also for inviting us to this conference. It's been really interesting. So I'm Malin. I'm the Director for Consultancy Services at the Center for Child Rights and Business. We were established in China 12 years ago as a child rights organization, working directly with businesses on improving their policies and practices so they can support and uphold child rights. And into that, we have, of course, the issue of child labor prevention and remediation. We have been working on that in a number of countries in Asia. We do that through businesses that we work with. So we don't work really with governments. We work directly with businesses and their supply chains. So we work with child labor cases that are either identified by ourselves through child labor risk assessment. It can be in manufacturing industries in India, or it can be in pepper plantations in Vietnam. Or we work with child labor cases that are being referred to us by auditors that are doing audits in global supply chains. So we are not an audit companies. We come in sort of to support the brands, the suppliers, and children with a proper remediation solution. So we have been doing that for more than 10 years in Asia. We are also now expanding our services to Latin America and also to Africa. And also last year, we even remediated 5 cases here in the US. So it's nothing new to us, even though that we are also as shocked as everyone else about the scale and sort of the persistence of this phenomena in the US. So I'm based here in New York. Very appropriate time, I think, to be based in the US. And I just wanted to mention one more thing. So we work on child rights, which is a broad topic. And I just wanted to go back to the discussion we had yesterday about migrant workers and to see them as a human being. And we work and have been working in countries in Asia for a long time on parenting trainings for migrant workers that are not living with the children, on how they can reconnect with the children. We train them in how to sort of detect issues that they are worried about from a distance. We empower the parents in their decision that they have left the children behind, and we do provide various kind of parenting trainings. We've done that for 10 years in hundreds of factories in Asia. And I think it's, again, this is a non-compliance issue. We are going to talk about child labor a lot, which is a compliance issue. But all of these things are linked, right? The kids that we are seeing in child labor situations are very often migrant children, one way or the other. So I just wanted to mention that as well, because I think yesterday it was really touching to hear about the migrants and get that face again, because I think we talk so much about these people but they are actually also human beings. They are also parents like myself and many of us in the room. So I just wanted to mention that as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And of course, you've all met Louise Herring from AIM Progress, but we're eager to hear AIM Progress's perspective on this issue.
Great, thank you, Sean. So Louise Herring from AIM Progress, as I've said a couple of times, we're a collaborative forum of 44 fast-moving consumer goods companies working together on human rights. A reasonable number of our members were named in the New York Times articles, obviously, so this issue is very relevant to us. I think I just wanted to say by way of introduction that I've worked in UK food and human rights for about 15 years now, and we've been talking about forced labour as a UK-specific issue for a very long time. So to some extent, I think your introduction, you talked about, you know, this being a kind of new topic. I think certainly for me, and I think in the conversations with members, what I was relaying was, you know, in the UK there's a recognition this is a real risk. Forced labour is a real risk, not so much child labour, but it's been a risk that's been acknowledged for quite a long time. And perhaps this is, you know, for corporates in the US, just a realisation that those risks are there, a change in mindset, that a country that you perceived as being low risk actually isn't. I know we'll go into the more detail of what we're doing, but I think there was a couple of things I just wanted to touch on by way of introduction. I think one was to say that in our approach, and would welcome the kind of comments on this, we are thinking of child labour and forced labour together. So we're acknowledging that if the figures are there about increased risks of child labour, then forced labour risks are also likely to be there as well. So we're thinking about these things together. The approach that we take is to be very practical. So as an organisation, that's what we're focused on, is what can we do, what should we be doing now? And that's what we'll touch a little bit more on. But also our strength as an organisation is the ability to drive convergence across our members and to say, actually, it's most likely unhelpful if company A does one thing, company B does another thing. So when we talk about the next steps and what we're planning, a lot of it is around collaboration and convergences of approach, how you can take common messages to supply chain partners, co-packers, manufacturers, labour providers, service providers, etc., and how can you build capacity and remediate issues. So that's something I think we'll come back to. And then I think the other thing that I just really wanted to emphasise from the outset is the response that we're taking to this is very much beyond compliance. So it's not a compliance-based audit response. That was, in our conversations that we've had together, it was the week one conversation, and then we moved on to say that the solution and how we deal with this has to be beyond compliance and has to be about remediation. And I think for all of our members that's extremely important. And perhaps just to touch a little bit on scale, we are an organisation that has US-based members, we also have European-based members, so this issue is a live and active one, probably for about 50% of our members is something that we'd expect them to be actively involved in.
Great, thank you. When we were last week talking as a panel about what we wanted to do today, we honed in on 5 or 6 structural issues that are common in recruitment abuse and common globally, right? That we wanted to share and then discuss as a panel how people are seeing these here in the US. The things that we've been talking about for a day and a half, right? Insufficient visibility and lack of clarity around accountability within supply chains. Assumption, as Louise just mentioned, here in the United States, that it's not a country of high risk, despite a lot of evidence from many, many years. Over-reliance on labor providers and little or no accountability for those agencies. The particular vulnerabilities of these populations due to poverty, due to migration status, due to demonization in various societies where migrants go. Little or no and poor, weak law enforcement, and essentially a lot of pointing of fingers or assumption that things are too complex and that people tend to throw up their hands around this problem. And so those were some of the major structural things that should be familiar to all of you from the various global forums we had in the past, but wanted to give the opportunity for each panelist to give a little bit of flavor and insight from what they're seeing around some of these structural issues. Diana?
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, I'd like to also just sort of ground us in the issue that, you know, child labor, we talk about as human trafficking as well. It starts with that, right? Like vulnerability is a starting point. So I think it's important that when we're thinking about how a trafficking situation happens, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. And I think it's important to put each individual person in that context, right? Before they even leave maybe their home community if they're a migrant, right? So how do vulnerabilities compound? And I think that's an important question, that trafficking is the result of something, right? It's normally when a lot of different systems maybe have failed a person and leaves them in this completely exploitative and vulnerable situation. So I always like to point back to that because we can talk about indicators and things like that, but it's always important to ground how the individual may be vulnerable to begin with. Here in the United States and through the National Human Trafficking Hotline, we've been able to get some reports around what we call minors in labor trafficking or child labor. And part of what we're seeing, and again, this is, not prevalence data by any means, but we see this across the industry. So we see this in agriculture, domestic work, peddling and begging rings, and so we see it across quite a few different industries. But when we start to delve into, again, what are those vulnerabilities that we're seeing, the first one that pops up, which is no surprise, is recent migration, right? And so what, again, recent migration, how does that place an individual in this country? What does that mean, right? That means maybe barriers in language, right? It means barriers in just knowing the system around you. So that's a key element. The next vulnerability that we tend to see, which is similar to what adult victims of labor trafficking incur, is debt. So we're seeing children coming into this country with debts already incurred, right? And again, those vulnerabilities compounding, right? They're in a new country, now they have a debt, right? And then aside from that as well, we're seeing vulnerabilities around unaccompanied migrants. In migration in this region, right, where we've definitely seen an increased reporting since 2018 in young children that are coming through borders and ending up in these situations. Some of the indicators and elements of force, threat, and coercion that we're also seeing tend to mirror what we see in adults in some cases. In some cases they're similar, in some cases they're different. It's similar in the same type of economic coercion that we're seeing again, right? And so by economic coercion, again, it can be debts, but it can also be withholding of wages of children, right? So children are, again, coming in debt, they're working, but they have to pay something off, they're getting their debt withheld. An element of force, threat, and coercion that we have also seen more with minors than with adults is an element of emotional coercion. That's usually something that is reported with adults, but definitely something that comes up more in the data, right? And that can be manipulation. Of course, these are young children, right? So it can be manipulation, abuse, and then all the other indicators that we see, right? Threats, right? Whether it's, all sorts of threats, even threats of deportation. So all those other elements are present in these conditions. And so I think for us, really, the important part is, again, getting at those systems, right? How do we start reforming the systems that allow this to happen, that a lot of times are shared with the systems that adults learn, right? They're sharing those spaces, right? They're in the same plants as, meat packers. So it's important to also think about the issue holistically. And sort of maybe a question I pose too is, when we talk about child labor, what is the connection with adult forced labor, right? When conditions are so poor for adults, what does that mean for children in those spaces, right? And what is that connection? How can that make a child more vulnerable? So I think I'll leave it there.
Great, yes, thank you. Rachel, what are you seeing?
Well, actually seeing a lot of what Deanna had said in terms of the issues around isolation, language access, lack of services and supports, and certainly debt is a major issue. And the one thing that I would add is where we're seeing cases of child labor and forced labor, they're often in plants where they are using staffing agencies. And so, for example, Reuters did an expose on child labor in the Hyundai and Kia plants. And we are bringing a class action against Hyundai and Kia for wage and hour fraud and other violations on behalf of guest workers, TN workers, visa holders who are employed in those same plants. And so just generally, like, what we're seeing is this role of staffing agencies being really significant in all of the industries where we're seeing cases of child labor.
Right, yeah. And Marlon, what are you seeing in terms of these global trends that you've worked on for years and how it's manifesting here in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think that it's very much the similar things that we see that we have seen in the countries that we have been working in Asia. We see, as you mentioned, is the recruitment, excessive use of recruitment agencies that are not monitored properly. It's insufficient visibility into the supply chains. It is over-reliance on subcontractors. Then we have this vulnerable population in this mix. So I think that companies that were named in the article and that are here in the US, I think that many of them can use their learnings and the best practices from the work that they have been doing in other global sourcing countries, because it's very much the same, right? I know the context is different, and we can talk about at length about weak legislations and weak enforcement, but that's in many other sourcing countries as well, right? That's nothing that is very specific for the US. So I think that there are a lot of learnings. Companies do have a lot of policies and procedures in place on how to handle these issues and how to deal with unauthorized subcontracting. So I would urge all companies to look into that, look what you have, use them also here in the US, because it's clear now that this is a high-risk country. We have similar issues that we are seeing everywhere else. And then I would like to address, again, the elephant in the room. And I'm also saying that because on Monday it was the International World Day of Child Labor, right? Which we have now but we have commemorated that for 10, 12 more than years. And we were having a series of webinars and we were discussing and so forth, and I was thinking to myself, am I going to sit here in 20 years' time on the World Day of International Child Labor? No, now I'm done. This has to be it, right? So it's also an urge to companies to look into your business practices, your sourcing practices. It comes down to that very, very often. We have vulnerable children, we have a lot of issues, sponsor program that doesn't work as well. But please, see your own role in this. See the link between your business operations, the way you do your purchasing, the way you put your orders, and see your role in this. And there are a number of things that all of us can support you with in that. And I think it's also a matter of acknowledging that we have these challenges, because if we can't talk about it openly, then it's very difficult to address them. So I think we all know that this is a challenge. We need to address them, and we have tools for that. So let's get started.
Great. Louise, you mentioned you have obviously American members as well as companies from other parts of the world. How much of a sense of American exceptionalism is the elephant in the room?
I have to be honest, it hasn't been part of the conversations we've been having. Like, a couple of people have asked me about that, as we've been talking together, and I think the response, from my perspective, the response from members, I think, has been a mature one. We haven't, we have been focused on what do we do next and what do we do next together. We haven't had conversations about sending out questionnaires to suppliers or auditing. We've said we know that we need to do more than that. I think the lessons, there are always more lessons we could learn from around the world, Marlon, so I totally take your point. But again, I think, the fact that there is experience of this issue in a different form, in forced labour form from the UK, from Europe, is actually really helpful, because it's something we can build on and we can say, let's not go down the compliance route. So the next steps that we are looking at and we're exploring together are about a lot of the things that, Marlon just touched on, which is how do we build understanding of this issue with those areas where there's more exposure to risk, so with labour providers or service providers or suppliers further down the supply chain. How do we increase the understanding of the causes of these risks? How do we try and build trust and openness? What role can those companies have in trying to open up the conversation about risk? And I think it's a big challenge for me. I guess the elephant in the room is what we need to see is more openness that these issues are out there. We need to see workers speaking up and saying, I'm worried about someone else on the factory floor, I'm worried that they're vulnerable, whether they're a child or an adult, I'm worried about them. You need suppliers in the supply chain opening up to their customers and saying, we have a challenge and we need to find a solution to that. Do we have the right culture for that at the moment? Do we have the right atmosphere? I'm not so sure about that one, but again, if I go back to my experience from the UK, there's always a case that sticks with me, which was there's a programme there. I don't know if Veronica from Stronger Together is here today, but she was here yesterday. There you are. Sorry, Veronica. So Stronger Together run a programme in the UK. It's been in existence for 10 years now. Part of that is about training workers and supervisors on site to recognise the signs of forced labour. As a result of that, at a Christmas party in a manufacturing site, this is in agriculture, this is food manufacturing, workers said to one of their colleagues, we weren't able to come to the Christmas party last year because the person who trafficked us locked us into our room and said we couldn't come. And so their colleagues raised that issue through the appropriate channels, and those people were able to kind of access help. And in a really kind of simplistic way, that's what we need to be able to kind of create, is this culture of openness where these issues do get opened up. But there are, and we'll get to public policy, there are lots of issues about doing that. But just on a very practical level, has been our focus. Is there is an element of oversight and there will need to be some transparency, but the conversation has been a mature one about engagement. It has touched a little bit on the financing question, probably not enough, but that link into purchasing practices, I always think there's more that we need to do in that area, and we kind of acknowledge that, but it has touched on that a little bit. So.
Great. As I mentioned before, we really wanted to spend some of our time talking about what remedy and remediation and justice looks like in this circumstance. Obviously, we know there's a long way to get to that point, but if we're not talking about it now, planning for it and identifying resources, then this is just going to be slower. So we're eager to hear from each panelist about how you're conceptualizing what remediation and remedy and justice looks like for these children and also the adults that may also be part of this in the specific U.S. context.
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, I think it looks in a lot of different ways. I think that obviously the most obvious one is paying workers what they're owed, right? I think that it just goes without saying, right? So there's obviously, even in that part, a lot of collaboration that needs to happen. I'm sure Rachel can talk more to it, but right now, the U.S. Department of Labor has created a partnership with the Mexican Secretaría de Bienestar to return and find workers and be able to give them back wages, right? And so that's a very key, obviously an important part. But when we, I'm thinking sort of what remediation we have here in the U.S. and for children, and I go back to part of what we do on the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and when we hear of children, we're mandated reporters, and so that immediately goes to the Department of Health and Human Services, to the Office of Family and Children, and there's a mechanism called an eligibility letter, right? And what that gives access to children for is basically if they're if a child meets a certain criteria and they might experience trafficking, this opens up some possibilities for them. And that includes access to services, access to specific case management. It opens up services to medical services, food assistance. So basically, the same services as a refugee, and that is important, right, for children who we detect to be able to have that access through the work that we do.
Rachel?
Yeah. I would agree on the enforcement of minimum wage and other wage protections, and just general working conditions for workers. The concerns or the issues that we've seen, I think probably lots of us are familiar with them, have been the implications for workers through mandatory reporting sometimes, which can create accessibility and eligibility for benefits, but can also cause harm in some instances, family separation and other issues. And so, you know, for us, like, we're really focused on ensuring that workers' rights as a whole are protected. And I think it's really important to take that into account too, because the child labor provisions are also, there's no private enforcement. And so our approach really is trying to protect the rights of workers to their wages and to other protections at work, health and safety.
If I may just kind of compliment Rachel's comment, I think that at the end of the day, that's the game plan, right? Because if workers' rights are protected, right, it doesn't have to get to that level, right? And so, to what Louise was saying, right, in that environment where, you know, there can be reporting of maybe things that are in child labor, but or of conditions that are subpar, it doesn't get to that, right? It doesn't get to that continuum of exploitation where kids end up in this way. So it's very important, very key to just start with that as a basis, right? And then when it gets to these extremes, then, you know, there's different mechanisms. So.
Oh, and you referenced earlier that there are protocols that companies have in place, how they've dealt with the problem when children have been found in their supply chains. How do you see that operating here in the U.S.?
Yeah, of course. I mean, just as every child labor case is different, all the remediation solutions also needs to be different. So last year we remediated 301 cases of child labor, which was our record year. A very sad record, but that shows how the situation is. And not a single one was a similar one. So we do remediation case by case. We're one of the few organizations that are doing that. It's a girl or a boy that's found in an industry or in a farm that gets sort of a personalized remediation program, because all kids then have the right to remedy when they have been sort of under harm, and that means that they should also not lose out economically on that. So we're providing a living stipend to the child and the family, so which is the same level as the minimum wage, and then we discuss with the child what their aspirations are for the future. What do they want to do? Can they go back to school if they have dropped out, or should we try to find a vocational training program? And this is, of course, very individual based. And then people say, yeah, but we have 50 kids here on a farm. We can't do that for every 50 kids. No, maybe not. We need to find other solutions. So that's also what we are working on now with a number of our brands and clients, to find sort of solutions where we have a large group of kids. And very often, so we have, I mean, child labor is also, it's below minimum age, right? Kids that are not allowed to work. But it's also children that are allowed to work, but there are young workers. And for the young workers, there are specific regulations in place that they shouldn't do hazardous work and so forth. But they have the right to work. So just to say that they shouldn't work means that they will find work somewhere else, in the informal sector, or in tier 2 or tier 3 or tier 4. So, I mean, and for them, when they are identified in hazardous work, it's a lot about providing them with decent work opportunities for youth. And I think that is one thing that we are discussing here with clients in the US. Because it's not that we can just say that, oh, we have to stop everything, kids, they have income enough, they shouldn't work. We need to find alternatives, right? So creating decent work for youth, where they are properly managed, where they have sort of managers that know how to set up decent working stations. Again, don't come to us and say, no, we can't have kids here because there's no work for them to do. We can always find the work for a youth that they can do. And we have shown that in various projects. So individual solutions, but we need also to find those broader solutions, decent work for youth. And then, and this is something very, very sort of early on. So I know that, so a number of companies have now paid civil penalties here in the US for $1 million, I think it is now. So since I'm new to the US and I don't really know how US budget functions, I turned to Global Child Labor Coalition based in Washington. Some of them may know Reed Mackey, who is working on this. And I was asking, sorry, but where do this money go? Can you just, does it go into the big, very basic question, I know, but it's like, and he was like, yes, it's going into the federal budget. But he said that he and his network is now lobbying for some of these funds to go back to a kind of an emergency fund for remediation purposes. That will, of course, take years, and he said also it needs some legislations, but I just want to share this here and now, because I think that was a very interesting thought as well. And then finally, then everyone asked, so who pays for the remediation? Well, the company that we work with, they pay for the remediation, or their suppliers pay for the remediation. The remediation is in various parts: living stipend for the child, some education or activity for the child before it meets minimum age, and some money for us or another organization to do the monitoring and the reporting and the follow-up with the child and the family.
Great. Yeah, it's interesting that possible solution with using the money echoes what honestly, as Sean was saying yesterday about how fines that the Customs and Border Protection might levy could also be used for a fund for workers. So interesting idea that hopefully our colleagues from the U.S. government, I know there are at least one here, might explore. Louise, I know this is relatively early in the process for AIM progress, but when you talk about convergence of your members around approaches, what are you seeing that's likely to happen around remedy?
So I think, yeah, exactly as you said, it is early days. But I think, I mean, I suppose what I felt I could add to the comments is that there's kind of immediate, for me there's an element about immediate steps in terms of remedy. So, you know, the organisations represented on the panel are the ones that will be able to provide the support, the longer term remediation, and certainly companies need to make better connections, you know, whatever type of company it is, to know who to go to know where to get help for longer term remediation. But I also think kind of one of our areas of focus in the immediate term is about how do you make sure that workers, once identified, whether they are child or adult survivors of forced labour, how do they get access to remediation? And I go back to my experience of working with really seasoned human resource professionals in the UK who come across cases of forced labour. And, you know, exactly as you just said, Marlon, they might have come across, it might be their 5th case of forced labour, or it might be their 1st, but actually for them to be able to know, what do I do? Like, these signs are presented on site, I know that I need to do something, I know I need to do the right thing, because we know from a myriad of examples that doing the wrong thing pushes people underground and makes the situation worse, and we don't want that to happen. So I think kind of an immediate step for us is to make sure that all those partners in the supply chain where there's a higher exposure to risk understand what is the thing that I need to do as my immediate first steps, what is responsible, how do we have a victim, sorry, I don't want to use that victim-centered approach, but how do we have a human-centric approach that says the first person I need to be concerned about is the child worker or the adult survivor of forced labour. How do I protect them, hear their story, respect their story, record their story, and then find ways to support them? And there are always those immediate steps of how do you find someone shelter or food, all of those things that need to be done in the 24 hours after you've identified there's a problem. And I think, you know, that for us is kind of our, in a way, what it feels like within our sphere of control. And then it's about being able to say to companies, and after that, you need to connect in with experts. You need to find out where the money's going to come from to support this and kind of the long-term steps. But yeah, that was just a reflection based on my kind of lived experience of working on this with suppliers in the UK.
Great, thanks. As many of you know, the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment, a major pillar of the activity has been public policy advocacy to use the power of businesses committed to responsible recruitment to reach out to countries, governments, and say, this matters for us, and you need to change your approach and your policies. So as we think about how businesses in this room and more broadly can and should advocate for policy difference, policy changes, what are the things that come to mind for you all?
I mean, definitely something that we're always hoping for is more enforcement, right, of just even the rules that exist. You know, there definitely needs to be more inspections of work sites, right, even just the number of inspectors. I forget the ratio, but you look at the ratio of inspectors to folks working, it's really not a sustainable model. So I think that for us is key to begin with. And for folks at the wage and hour, to be trained in what to look for, right? We encounter sometimes folks from these departments that, tell us, I've been an inspector, but, we haven't had any training on this. So we're trying to look for this one thing. So it's kind of like just very focused on these issues. And a lot of times the issue can be right in front, but it's not noticed. And it goes to sometimes a lot of the misconceptions around human trafficking and forced labor and what that looks like. And for folks that are not as familiar with the issue, a lot of times they're thinking of coercion factors that involve somebody being tied or locked up, which can happen. But when we look at the factors of forced and coercion in these situations, it's obviously, as we've been speaking out for the past day and a half, it's much more in a way insidious than that, right? It can be in front of us, but it's somebody, again, who is in a bondage, right, and who has these conditions around them. So for us, I think that is just sort of the starting point, is to get more folks on the ground to be able to detect these cases.
Great. Rachel, you're a real expert in what kind of lobbying should be done around the guest worker program. Is there an angle there or some other approaches that you're thinking of?
I mean, there's definitely an angle there. And certainly we have had minors in the H-2A program. And what we don't have is data that really disaggregates sufficiently by age. There's a large category that's like 15 to 19, which is a pretty big range. And we've actually seen a significant increase in the number of visas that have been issued to workers in that category, like in that age range. But it's not like disaggregated enough for us to be able to even, have a sense of where those workers are, what age they actually are. Are they all 15-year-olds or 19-year-olds? And so certainly, like on the transparency piece, I also like additional scrutiny on, the staffing and recruitment agencies and the entire recruitment chain would be important. Yeah, and of course agree with the recommendation for more enforcement of minimum wage and other worker protections. Yeah.
Great, thanks. What do you see in terms of policy advocacy that maybe has worked in other places that we might try here?
Oh, that's tricky. I mean, I do write child labor policies, but I'm not a policy person otherwise. But yeah, I think I would like to go back also to this. I think also businesses can lead right. Businesses can take the lead by practice. Look at how businesses are taking the lead in the transformation within environment, for example, in Europe, where we see private sector is leading. So I think here it's also in the human rights space, there is also an opportunity for responsible companies to take the lead, show that this actually can work. We can work on youth development programs and so forth. But I also think it comes back to training and education. We can see, for example, when we train auditors on child labor prevention, we can see that those auditors are detecting much more child labor than untrained auditors. And that goes for labor inspectors as well. Train them on detection of child labor. But then equally important, and then going to what Louise says, is to train them on first response, right? Because there is so much harm if a child labor is detected and it's not taken care of, right? If a child, so that's even worsening the situation. So also train them in first response, how to talk to children in a responsible way, how to not scare them away, and then also have something. Then what's the solution? Okay, you have identified the kid. What do we do now? You can't just leave them there. So a lot of things can be done, I think, sort of at the state and the government level. But I think also we have a momentum a little bit. So let's not just wait for everyone else to do the job. I think let's work together and because we have a lot of experience, a lot of competence in this room. I think we can move the agenda forward.
Okay. Finally, well, I'm not necessarily putting this on the person representing business here. We know that many states in this country are relaxing, weakening their child labor laws, and also that businesses often been fighting against strengthening child labor laws in the U.S. at the federal level. For many of you who aren't from the United States, you may not realize that a lot of child labor in agriculture is legal here in the U.S. And so I'm just curious, any of you, but from you, Louise, if you have input on this, your sense of how much business is willing to step up to the plate and talk about those and advocate for a higher floor for children, as well as maybe strengthening rather than relaxing of state level laws.
Okay, so this is going to sound like I'm dodging the question, but I'm not trying to dodge the question. But genuinely, Aid Progress, we're not an advocacy organisation, so I don't want to talk on something that we don't do, to be honest. I think what we're trying to work on is a practical programme through which we will be, and from the outset, happy to talk to anyone at that level about the programme and what we're trying to do, and to open that to anyone else from any other industry that wants to be part of it. But yeah, I don't want to pretend, Sean, that we have a platform on that. So
I
I'll
understand,
pass on at that point.
I just felt it was important to mention this because these are really important contextual factors.
Yeah.
Why don't we go to our questionnaire, our questioner extraordinaire, Bonnie, with questions from the...
I'm afraid it's the less extraordinary one.
Okay.
It's Francesca. Bonnie's having a well-deserved break. So there are 3 questions, one that's already been answered, so 3 here, and just one that I have. I'm going to stay sitting down, so I need to get the wording right. I'm not well versed on this issue. It's very interesting, this panel, but one for me, I wonder if there are any positive examples of industry associations and state bodies that other states and industry associations can look at within the US, depending on if there are industries where child labour is more prevalent. And then 2 questions from the audience in the room that I guess can be taken together. What are the systemic issues that make it easier for employers to employ children as opposed to migrants via legal visa programs? And what programs other than fines to offenders are being used to prevent forced child labour? And then this one, I'm going to read this one because this is where I don't know it so well. So in terms of purchasing practices due diligence, have there been good examples, perhaps out of the UK or elsewhere, of companies moving more towards open book contracting, or at least sharing labour costing as non-negotiable part of service agreement between customer and client?
Okay, an interesting range of questions. Anybody want to take some of them? Perhaps Louise on that last question about the situation in the UK with open book?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've had some examples of, I don't know if it counts as open book, we've certainly had some examples of ethical recruitment models, I think, on yesterday's panel. For open book costings, yes, there are some examples that I'm aware of from the UK. I don't think they're just in the UK. Examples in dairy, for example, a retailer that I worked with was doing that kind of 10 years ago, which I think is helpful. There's also, I'm not employed by Stronger Together, but sorry, just to reference some work that they've done, called the Fair's Fair campaign, which if people haven't seen it, is a UK-specific report, but it talks specifically about purchasing practices in labour recruitment supply chains, and talks about everything from payment terms through to penalties and other practices that cause problems for labour recruiters. And I think that's a really underutilised report and piece of research. It is UK, but I imagine it applies, would apply as much kind of in the US context. So yeah, a few examples.
Okay. Rachel?
Oh, I forgot I have one. What I would just mention about the first question in terms of positive examples, I don't really have any positive examples, but there are 10 states where we've seen efforts to weaken child labor protections in the last few years. And in a lot of those states, we've seen those efforts backed by protein processing industries, hospitality, construction, some of the same industries that are also pushing for, expansion of employer controlled guest worker programs. And so there's definitely some overlap in that regard too, and it's worth looking at. And we have a little chart, and also I would recommend, if folks are interested in that and the role that industry associations have played in the efforts to kind of weaken child labor protections, EPI has a nice report about this on their website, Economic Policy Institute. So we'd check that out.
And just to add to Rachel's comment, we're in tandem today. those same industries are the ones that we're seeing reporting on the hotline. So we all, it's a system, right? It's weakening the laws, right? It's from these same industries, and then we're seeing the reports on that end. So I think it sort of shows how it all sort of leads to that movement. Yeah.
Good. Other questions for us, Francesca?
There is one more question here. How do you think that the US government and governments of countries of origin of migrant children in child labour can work better together to prevent child labour, also considering that most child labour takes place in the informal sector?
Good question. So the issue of the informal sector and then the origin countries, maybe Rachel, you work a lot in Mexico and other origin countries. Any thoughts there?
Not a ton, honestly, but what I would say is, certainly supports through the consulates, and for workers, for young people who go to the consulates, that can definitely be a base of support, and also for returned workers who may have the need to claim their benefits and their the compensation that they're owed once they get home. So. I don't have, really strong recommendations on that, other than the ones that we would say should apply to all workers in terms of providing a base of support and services throughout a worker's experience, from recruitment to when they go home.
And it's a transnational issue, especially here in the U.S. when we look at the country of origin of a lot of the victims, right? And no surprise, right? Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. And so a lot of that collaboration with country of origin is key. We also do a lot of work with consulates, right? I think somebody yesterday was talking a lot about trust, right? And so sometimes that initial step can be trusting your own government, right? Maybe you're not familiar with this country, but the consulates can sometimes be sort of an opening. We've done trainings for consular officials here in the U.S., but primarily Mexican consular officials, and they've already started detecting cases, right? Again, sometimes it's just knowing that it's there, right? And once they have that closeness, or maybe sharing those spaces, they're going to migrant detention centers, or people are coming in, they're able to grasp that, and get the ball rolling.
Okay, good. Any comments on the challenges or opportunities related to the informal sector? Alan, maybe?
Informal sector, yes. Yeah, I don't know really what to say there, to be honest. I think we have a lot of issues in the formal sector that we need to address, and I don't say we shouldn't address the informal sector, but cleaning up the formal sector and provide decent work for all will also eventually clean up the informal sector, right, in a way. So I think it goes hand in hand, and I think it's also, again, I think one question was about systematic issues as well, and I think one of the things is also, again, know your supply chain, right? Unauthorized subcontracting. Very often it comes down then to informal sector partners down the line, so to say. So you need also to be aware of that, that you have, and do a mapping on your supply chain, know your risks, know who they are. We just recently worked in India with a brand who thought they had 10 subcontractors. It turned out that it was 106 when we did the mapping. So, and a lot of them were in the informal sectors. It's again getting that visibility into your supply chain.
I'm curious if there's some other comments that panelists want to make, particularly around the fact that these exposés have focused on sectors that in the past many people didn't think child labor was present or forced labor, right? So unfortunately people hear a lot of stories, a lot of documentation around child labor in agriculture, but they were talking about manufacturing plants, protein facilities, places like that. And I'm just curious if any of you want to highlight more some of the characteristics of those sectors that might enable participants here to better think about how they should approach that, where they may have been thinking about this issue in the United States primarily from an agricultural lens.
I'm happy to take that one. I mean, I think, again, I suppose I go back and think about my kind of UK experience, and I think about what are the jobs that are cold and wet, you know, and that could be a meat processing factory as much as it is in agriculture. What are the jobs where, you know, the average American or European doesn't want to work? And I think that is often, I can't speak for the exact automotive sector because it's not a sector that I've worked in, but, you know, in kind of FMCG and food, those are often the kind of sectors where I think you see risks, where it's difficult to, you know, part of this relates to, you know, the tightness of the labour market in the US and those kind of challenges of getting workers in. That is part of the kind of challenge. So I think, I mean, what I'd say is start from a position of assuming that the risk can apply everywhere. The filters that certainly I have always thought of and that we would talk to members about would be look at where you've got large percentage of temporary labour, whatever form that is in. I had an experience from household products. This goes back to UK retailer days where, you know, it was a very mechanised factory. It was producing cleaning products, but actually because the retailer that I worked for was doing promotions off and on for the brand, their volumes would go up exponentially every time the own brand product was on sale. So actually they had a flood of temporary workers coming in for a month-long period or a couple of week period. So that's a risk that you get because of purchasing practices, but you wouldn't necessarily associate that sector with high risk. So I think thinking about those filters, thinking about actually what's the volumes in the kind of sites, how many kind of temporary workers do we have in, what's the nature of the work, is it easy to recruit, yes or no, you know, what's turnover, what's absenteeism on sites, a lot of those kind of factors I think are the things that you need to build in rather than perhaps the kind of, you know, the global data does help, but you have to get more granular than that and look within countries, within regions, within states, you know, and Verite themselves have done some great work looking at state level, you know, where are there large numbers of displaced children. I think those kind of things are the things that you need to be looking at to really kind of unpick the risks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I had one other question, just really briefly. We've talked a lot over the past day and a half about European due diligence, the Tariff Act, not just here in the US, but in other countries that are starting up, Mexico, Canada, elsewhere. How much do you think this situation in the United States with child labor and forced labor is going to be seen, enforced, dealt with by those actors, which could put additional pressure on American companies?
Well, we hope definitely that it is, right? I think the Tariff Act is an important tool, but it's in thinking about you know, this issue. I think it kind of goes without saying, but the onus can't be on either workers or children, right? And so I know we're running out of time here, but it's to sort of sum up, right? It's about how all these different factors come in and play a role, right? And so, of course, workers should have a way to report and should be empowered to know their rights. But again, the onus can't be on them. They're already in difficult situations. And so a lot of the thinking is how do we move around those different systems or those different points in the system to be able to start creating that accountability. Yeah.
Right. Okay. If there are no, Rachel?
No, it's okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we'll wind it up there. I know that we only have a half hour, I believe, for lunch. And so please join me in thanking our panel for this really insightful. So back in 30 minutes?
I was gonna.
Okay.